Hi, Mike.
Hey, Jason.
Okay, so you can hear me fine?
Yep, we've only got 6 people on. We should let more people. Okay.
Yeah, we can just kind of wait till. I'm gonna see more people joining. Hey, Jackson.
Hello.
I'm gonna see if my screen sharing works, because I'm gonna do a screen share. 1 second. Okay. So, hi everybody who's joined so far. Thanks for coming. I am going to paste into the chat window, if you want to open that up, I'm pasting a link to the text that we're reading, just in case you don't have it. There it is. And as we get going, I'm also going to share my screen. So I'm just going to try that right now real quick, see if it works. Share screen. Share. Can you guys see this?
Yep.
Cool. Okay. These are my slides that I made to explain the first 2 chapters. So I'll do that. I'll go through that real quick before we really get started. And then I'll also, I'll have the text up as I'm reading so folks can follow along, or if people want to just have their screen with the text. All right, I'll stop sharing now. Okay.
I like your headset, Jason.
Thanks.
Very professional.
It's very serious. I'm like command center. Hey, Derek.
Hey guys. Yeah, I like it too.
Yeah, thanks. It's actually Lacey's. I've got my partner Lacey here. She's joining.
You're welcome.
How's everybody doing?
Doing good.
Hey, Rebecca. Thanks for coming back.
Oh, it worked this time. Great.
Yeah.
Oh, Rebecca's muted. I think everyone when they join is muted.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, folks are muted by default, and it's a good idea to have your microphone muted if you're not speaking, just because there's going to be a lot of people.
Yeah.
Jerry. And
Dzień dobry. How's everyone doing?
hi. Who do we have here?
That's Victoria. She's from the ULF. I invited her.
Oh,
I told
great.
her to register. I invited a couple of ULF people.
Welcome.
He's a comrade from, where are you living at the moment? St. Louis?
South of St. Louis, but yes.
Cool. It's getting more spread out. That's the cool thing about doing this on Zoom, actually.
Yeah, that's the one thing that I said. I was like, I got to be useful and send it out to people that otherwise can't come to CWL stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, there should be a few more people.
Yeah, I think Alex might come, and I know Joey definitely is.
Yeah, they were just talking about it. I saw on Discord.
Yeah.
Okay, and welcome, Larry. I don't know if have you joined us in the past? I can't remember. Oh, okay. I think you said first time, but you're muted, so I'm not totally sure.
Oh, I should probably switch to computer, because I can't see everyone on phone. I should probably do
Yeah,
that.
and some people might not want to be on camera the whole time. That's fine too. So people might pop in and out. Hello, new person just joined. Elle, is it?
Yes, it's
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
good to see you too.
You can't see
Welcome.
me. I muted myself, my picture while I'm eating lunch.
No problem.
Yeah, I'm going to be helping Jason with this meeting. I've got the control panel on my laptop, and I have things like I can mute everybody if I want. We're just learning this technology now, so you're going to have to be patient with us. But for those that are new to this, if you're on a laptop, a big screen opens up, and you'll have a lot of options at the bottom. If you put your mouse you scroll to the bottom, you'll see things like mute, stop video, manage participant. Oh, I have that. I don't think you do. There's a chat button. I don't know if we want to use that in this thing. There's a sharing screen also. And I would prefer that people don't share screens, only Jason. It can become very messy if we do that. And when we start, I can make a recording of this. I hope it's a video recording. And we'll have it for future reference.
Oh, god dang it, because I registered on my phone. It won't let me join on computer without registering again, I think.
That's what happened to me last time.
Yeah, and oh yeah.
I tried to do it on my mobile, and then I tried to jump on the laptop, and it was not cooperating. It just sent me in circles. But Jerry walked me through earlier, and I worked out fine this time. So
Awesome. Way to go, Jerry.
he is awesome.
So if I re-register on my computer, it'll let me join? Question mark.
If you have like a login that you use on every device, I would think that would let you do it everywhere or on whichever device you chose, but I'm not totally sure.
Okay, I'll try it out.
We've also noticed that the experience is easier if you download or create a Zoom account, a free Zoom account. Just life becomes easier.
Okay, so
And of course, they capture personal information off your phone and all that, and that's why they make it free.
yeah, I tried to join in with the Zoom account and it's saying no. That's weird. I guess I'll just hang out on phone. It's whatever.
So we'll get started in a few minutes, but it seems like people are still jumping in. I was just saying to Mike, we were just having a conversation before we started this that, you know, we did chapters 1 and 2, and we took about 3 hours. These meetings are usually, these reading groups have been 3 hours. Chapters 1 and 2, we had no problem getting through the text. Chapter 3 is a little bit longer. We still will try to get through it, but if we don't manage to get through the entire thing, I think the most important thing is that we get into a bit of a conversation about maybe some of the topics that are going on today that are relevant around the text, like specifically COVID-19, economic crises. Jerry had brought up the fact that Bernie just dropped out of the race. So there's a lot of things we could talk about around the text that are relevant. I think it'd be good to get into that as well. So if we don't finish the text, maybe you'll be interested enough to go ahead and finish it on your own. Or if you've already read the text, then great. All right, so we've got a couple more people. I think, Joey, is that you? You signed on? I see your name. Hey, and we've got Sarah. Welcome. It's a little bit hard to do intros on Zoom, I've found, because not everybody sees the face or everybody's face in the same order. So there's no way to know, like, oh, I'm next, let me introduce myself. But if anybody wants to sign in and introduce themselves, or before you speak, if you have something to say, if you just want to introduce yourself, feel free. And we got Abiyumi coming in. Awesome. Hi, Abiyumi. I think I can hear him.
I can't hear him.
I hear something in the background.
He's muted.
There we go. Okay. Hi, Abiyumi. Hopefully he can hear us.
Hello.
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 Thanks for joining.
Okay.
We
So I
have
hope
15 people on the call now. We can wait. Oh, here's another one coming in.
I guess people will continue to maybe jump in. I know you're in control of that, right, Mike?
Right. And the reason we're doing it this way is because, well, it's not perfect, but we want to make sure we don't get attacked by the right wing. They've been bombing. They call it Zoom bombing. They've been coming into these meetings with racist garbage and attacking people who are participating. And that's why we have you register and why we're going through these extra steps now. We don't want to have to deal with it. Now we will eventually be able to kick these people off, but it can be several minutes of just awful stuff. They try to take over the screen and put up whatever they're trying to push. So anyway, we haven't done these classes online before. We usually do them in our office at 5920, and for obvious reasons, we're not meeting there. But I'd like everyone to realize or understand that there are no stupid questions when we're going through these works. The whole point of this is for all of us to get a better understanding of revolutionary ideas so that we can implement them as we organize and try to change the system that we live in. And I think what we've seen over the last few months clearly indicates that we need a new way of doing business among the people of the United States, and that the people that run this country are clueless and don't seem to have our best interests or even our worst interests in mind. They just don't have us there. So I'm going to be muting my video now and then because I have a dog I have to deal with and things like that. But I hope everybody enjoys this experience. We're all learning how to do this. And I'd like to make one announcement. Moratorium Now, which is our mass group that we have in Detroit, it's been around for 12, 13 years, doing work around issues of austerity and international issues as well. We're having a big meeting on Monday, another Zoom meeting. That's instead of our usual weekly meetings at 5920 2nd Avenue. And this time it's going to be dedicated 100% to bringing in Cuban medical help into this United States. There are two components to it. One is the drugs that they have developed that are being used in other countries right now to treat people who have COVID-19 disease. And of course, none of this is allowed to enter into the United States. So we're going to be launching a campaign to figure out how we can get clinical trials of that, one of the drugs, interferon alpha 2B, into the Detroit area. There are also you'll find out there are going to be other drugs that Cuba has that can help people. They just introduced another one in Cuba last week. It's a homeopathic application of something. But it's to help people who are more susceptible to getting the disease from coronavirus. It'll boost their immune system, apparently. So this is the kind of interaction with Cuba that we're going to want to build at our meeting on Monday. We are also going to see if there's a way to request Cuban medical brigades into the United States. It's the Harry Reeve Brigade. They go around the world helping people. Of course, that's going to be a big struggle. We'll talk about it on Monday. Native Americans or indigenous people, the Anishinaabe and another group, have already tried this in Manitoba and have been rejected by the Canadian government. They're not allowed to ask Cuba for help. But in any case, we have a dire shortage of doctors developing in Southeast Michigan right now. So join us on Monday if you want to get involved in that kind of activism. So with that being said, does anyone else have any announcements? Anything they want to say before we turn it over to Jason? Once again, please stay muted until you want to talk. And you don't have to raise your hands or anything. It says, when you see an appropriate break, you want to ask a question, go ahead and do that. Okay?
I had a real hard time signing in on my computer. It doesn't seem to work. I did everything right, and on the phone it works, so I have no idea what the deal is. Just that's all.
Jackson had a similar issue.
Yeah, I got it to work. I just had to download the app on my computer. I couldn't do it through browser.
I have the app.
Yeah, I don't know. Zoom's weird. This is like my second time ever using Zoom. It's just super weird.
There's a bit of a learning curve, but yeah, every time we try it, we get a little better at it.
What I
Jason,
do is I
I
launch.
got a, Jason, I got a message from Zoom that I could only stay on for 40 minutes
Well, that's strange because
because it's not a paid.
well, that's strange because we have a paid account that we're hosting the meeting from.
Okay.
So it should work, but if you get booted, try to sign back on.
Sure enough.
Hopefully
Thank
it will work.
We've had calls that go beyond 40 minutes. We've used his account a couple times so far. Addressing your concern, Sharon, when you're on your laptop or your Chromebook, launch the meeting from a browser like Firefox or Chrome, and that will then automatically, it should download the app if you don't have it already. That's how I do it. And you're muted right now. We can see your lips are moving, but we can't hear anything.
Okay, well, at least you're
try
joining us. Yeah, at least you're here on the phone. Hopefully, yeah, we're all at least here. Okay, so it seems like we've got quite a few people. It's great. Let's go ahead and get started. I am going to attempt to do a welcome, whoever just joined. I'm going to attempt to do a brief recap of the first two chapters for anyone who's new, and just to kind of get our head back in the game a little bit. It's going to be really moving quickly because they're long pieces of text, but I just have a couple of slides that I want to share. And as Mike said, as I'm going through, if you want to jump in with a question, feel free. And yeah, this is just my best shot at trying to really briefly sum up some of what was in the earlier chapters. So okay, now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick and go up to the top. All right, so yeah, again, just feel free to jump in, but let's just talk really quickly about chapter 1. Can folks see my screen? Okay, so chapter 1, Engels began by talking about what socialism is. He basically breaks it down really quickly into two antagonisms that exist in society, in the real world. One of them being capitalists versus wage workers. So that's a pretty straightforward idea. I think we're all familiar with that antagonism in our lives. The second antagonism is what he calls socialized production versus anarchy in production, which Derek actually launched us into a very good conversation about what is anarchy in production. It was a really good conversation. Just briefly, we talked about the fact that in a free market economy with no central planning, commodities get produced in various amounts and without any planning by society, and that goes in contrast with what Engels calls socialized production, which is people working together to make the commodities. So without going deeper into it, he's saying that the contrast between the fact that we produce things together as social groups versus that there's just total anarchy in the way that things are produced and the way they're distributed. That's where socialism comes out of. That's what causes us to want to make socialism. So Engels will contrast these materialist bases with the idealist beliefs that socialism sprang from the heads of great thinkers. So what he's going to do is he's going to say they come out of real life, they don't come from ideas in our heads. So I made this slide, hopefully it makes sense. This is sort of a historical context background to understand how we get to socialism, but it's coming from the other way of thinking, the way that Engels is rejecting, the sort of, I call it the great men or the great thinkers version. We have feudalism with lords and serfs, which goes into capitalism with the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and then eventually into socialism, which is just a worker state. But according to the great man theory of history, they're all based on great thinkers. So in feudalism, first of all, who knows who the great thinkers are in feudalism? I don't think that really matters. He's not necessarily saying that was based on great thinking, but capitalism was based on great thinkers from the great French philosophers and some early economists, just based on people's ideas. And then the idea that socialism is based on he talks in the first chapter about these three great thinkers of the utopian socialists, Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Robert Owen. So that's one version of how society works. Contrasting that with a different version, these three types of society aren't based on great thinkers at all. They're based on realities of the way things are produced in society. So feudalism was based on agriculture. This is very rough, but just as a quick way of thinking about it, let's say feudalism was based on agriculture, capitalism was based on the production of commodities, the change over to that way of creating things. And then the socialism, furthermore, would be based on the fact that that production became socialized. So it's a different way of thinking about how society moves forward from one mode to the next mode. I don't know if that makes sense, but that for me is basically what he's talking about in the first chapter. So he goes on just really briefly. He says, what did the utopian socialists really do? What did they create? Basically, they created propaganda. They created treatises. They created they brought out their ideas and presented them to society. And then in some cases, they even created working models of their societies, like Robert Owen's factories and societies that were based on a communistic way of functioning. And he proved that that method of living and that method of society worked in a bubble. But when he presented it more broadly to society, he was not met with a lot of his ideas weren't accepted. Let's say he was considered somebody who was formerly considered to be a very great man, a very smart man, was considered that he'd gone off the deep end, and the capitalist system didn't take kindly to his ideas. I would argue that is, you could see reflections of that with Bernie Sanders today. Engels' quote, I think it kind of sums up the first chapter. The more completely, and by they he means the utopian socialist thinkers, the more completely their new worlds were worked out in detail, the more they could not avoid drifting off into pure fantasies. So Engels and also Marx were very, very interested in utopian socialists, but they criticized the fact that they would kind of sort of create worlds over there in kind of in their head or in a bubble and say, hey, that's how we should make society. But they didn't see how could we get our society today to get to that point. So that was basically chapter one. I'm sorry, I think this might end up being pretty long, so I'm going to try to move quickly, but if anybody has any questions, definitely jump in. Now, getting on to chapter two, Engels gets a little bit more philosophical. He sort of wants to lay out, well, how does the world actually work? And he presents two dualities. One is metaphysics versus dialectics. The other is idealism versus materialism. So he'll go through the basically different iterations of these dualities and talk about them. You have on the one hand metaphysical idealism, which basically says the world is made of ideas which never change. I picked these little images to reflect my opinion of some examples of that kind of thinking and what that represents in the world. Ideas which never change. That's how the world works, right? The next way would be to pair dialectics with idealism. And then in this sense, you still have that the world is made of ideas, but now the ideas can evolve over time. So I have here I have Aristotle and Hegel, which Marx and Engels really appreciated, and the idea of coming up with the concept of an atom in your head or something like that. So ideas which are evolving. Then we have the idea of materialism. We're switching to the fact that the world isn't made of ideas. The world is made of real physical things. But now those physical things, if from a metaphysical point of view, never change. So an example that we came up with last time was the idea of butterflies behind glass in a butterfly collection. We see that the world is made of these real things, but they're removed from their natural habitat, so to speak, and we investigate them for their internal properties, and we don't look at the fact that they exist in context with other things. They never change, and they're kind of transfixed on their own. That was an early, Engels said that was an early way that sort of natural scientists analyze the world around them. Then we move on to the last example of how the world works, which is Engels and Marx' opinion of how the world really works, which is that the world is made of physical things which are evolving. So it's dialectical materialism. And as you can see, I've chosen not a butterfly behind glass, but photographs of a butterfly in the real world evolving through its various stages. So that's a different way of looking at nature, understanding that things are evolving. And then also we have this image that was representative, I think, of the Paris Commune, and that represents societal version of dialectical materialism, which is revolutions and people rising up and bringing forth a new mode of society. So that's what Engels and Marx are putting forward. That's how they say the world really works. And that was what chapter 2 was all about. And he's going to use that different way of analysis to reject the utopian socialists. We talked about that in the last meeting. I'm going to make this available if people want it, but I'm not going to go too deep into it. But basically, one thing that Engels talks about is the fact that metaphysics and idealism, they really kind of go together. If you really break them down, you can see that they naturally seem to fit together. They work well together. By the same sense, dialectics and materialism work well together. So essentially what we end up with are these 4 ways of looking at the world. Engels is saying that metaphysical idealism, although it makes sense, it's incorrect, it's wrong, that's not how the world actually works. These two, dialectical idealism and metaphysical materialism, they don't even make sense on their own. They're oxymorons. And this is a little bit my own analysis, but I think it's pretty clear. It's in the text that we actually kind of discovered this as a group in the last reading group. Those two don't even make sense. And what we do is we proceed onward to realizing that a dialectical materialism, not only does it work, but it's correct. That is the way the world actually works. A world of real things which are evolving. So given that understanding, we're going to now go forward into chapter 3, which is basically beginning to kind of do scientific socialism and analyze how capitalism works and how it moves forward. And it's called historical materialism. And that's kind of his version of dialectical materialism as it is applied to history, and looking at history as something that moves forward and is based on material relations of people and how they produce the things that they need to live. Okay, so before we get going into actually reading, does anybody want to either ask any questions about any of the things I said, make any observations, or anything like that?
I don't got anything to add. Sorry, this is Victoria here. Sorry.
Thank you. Chime in.
Again, nothing to add. But, like when you said dialectical idealism was oxymoronic, I have to especially agree. Because, if anybody were to go through the pains of reading Hegel, he capitulates a lot to materialism. So, it is really oxymoronic. And other than that, yeah, when you talked about the great thinkers, yeah, the clergy are basically, the clergy would fit that great thinkers thing. Otherwise, nothing to add. Carry on.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I mean, again, if anybody wants to add anything, just feel free to jump in at any time. But I guess let's just go ahead. Chapter 3. Does anybody want to volunteer to read the beginning?
I can.
Okay. Yeah. Again, I'm gonna keep sharing my screen and scrolling as we go.
You want me just to read the first paragraph or page, or to where?
I can't even tell what pages are what online, but yeah, I mean, read as much as you like. First paragraph, 3 paragraphs, whatever you feel like.
All right, I'll go to that whole thing, to production.
Okay.
The materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life, and next, to production, the exchange of things produced, is the basis of all social structure, that in every manner of society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed in society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought, not in men's brains, not in men's better insights into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. They are to be sought not in philosophy, but in the economics of each particular epoch. The growing perception that the existing social institutions are unreasonable and unjust, that is the reason, that reason has become unreason and right wrong, is the only proof that the modes of production and exchange changes have silently taken place with, oh my god, sorry, I'm just getting caught on my own words, with which the social order adapted to earlier economic conditions is no longer in keeping. From this, it also follows that the means of getting rid of incongruities that have been brought into light must be present in a more or less developed condition within the changed modes of production themselves. These means are not to be invented by deduction from fundamental principles, but are to be discovered in the stubborn facts of the existing system of production. And then what is then the position of modern socialists in this connection?
Awesome. Anybody want to continue or ask any questions or make any observations? Derek? Awesome. You're muted right now.
Okay. All right. Well, since we're going to do it like this, can someone like summarize that paragraph for us? You know, a quick synopsis of it so we can move on. But, you know, just so we all get the understanding.
Yeah, thank you.
What I kind of got from it while reading it is basically society is not about, you know, these made up ideas. It's about society is based around production and how things are produced. It doesn't matter about, like, human life is second next in this current system to how society is structured and how class are based, all based around how wealth is distributed and how products are exchanged. And then he even talks a little bit about something I think a lot of people are coming to think now, is that, you know, quote unquote, the growing perception that the existing social institutions are becoming unreasonable and unjust. The reason and then the media and things like that are trying to turn this reason into unreason and trying to say that this is wrong and trying to say, like, oh, this is incorrect, even when many people are clearly seeing that the system is not working.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, this first paragraph does kind of go a little bit over the same ground as in the last two chapters a bit. And, you know, he spells it out pretty clear. I mean, it's not in the philosophy, but it's in the economics that we can look to see how a particular society works. And something that Marx and Engels will say pretty often is that philosophy isn't the basis of a society, but it's just a reflection of what society is. So we might have a society that works in a certain way. Whatever our philosophies of that society are, whatever the myths and the belief systems, those are just reflections of that system. It's not the other way around. It's not that our system is a reflection of what we believe and the myths and the stories we tell each other. So he's always flipping that around. He's been doing that throughout this whole text so far, flipping it around so that we understand that the basis of society is really the economics. Yeah. Anyone else?
Why don't we move on?
Let's move on. Anybody want to pick up? Okay. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay. So the present situation of society, this is now pretty generally conceded, is the creation of the ruling class of today, of the bourgeoisie. The mode of production peculiar to the bourgeoisie, known since Marx as the capitalist mode of production, was incompatible with the feudal system, with the privileges it conferred upon individuals, entire social ranks, and local corporations, as well as with the hereditary ties of subordination, which constituted the framework of its social organization. The bourgeoisie broke up the feudal system and built upon its ruins the capitalist order of society, the kingdom of free competition, of personal liberty, of the equality before the law of all commodity owners, of all the rest of the capitalist blessings. Thenceforward, the capitalist mode of production could develop in freedom. Since steam, machinery, and the making of machines by machinery transformed the older manufacture into modern industry, the productive forces evolved under the guidance of the bourgeoisie, developed with a rapidity and in a degree unheard of before. But just as the older manufacture in its time and handicraft, becoming more developed under its influence, had come into collision with the feudal trammels of the guilds. So now modern industry, in its complete development, comes into collision with the bounds within which the capitalist mode of production holds it confined. The new productive forces have already outgrown the capitalistic mode of using them, and this conflict between productive forces and modes of production is not a conflict engendered in the mind of man, like that between original sin and divine justice. It exists, in fact, objectively, outside us, independently of the will and actions even of the men that have brought it on. Modern socialism is nothing but the reflex, in thought, of this conflict in fact. Its ideal reflection in the minds, first, of the class directly suffering under it, the working class. Now, in what does this conflict consist?
Great. Do you want to continue, or does anybody want to talk about that passage at all?
Maybe we should continue because it gets into what.
Okay. Rebecca seems like wants to say something.
The only thing I'd want to add is that I think most of our presidents are blood related to the old kings. So if you look back, that's all I'd want to add.
Well, I don't know anything about that.
That's all done with, but I'm not sure.
Sure.
I'm not really sure about that, but okay. Yeah, I mean.
On a separate note, this is Victoria here. On a separate note, like going even to people like, descendants of, Jane Addams or whatever, there have been corporations tied with presidents, quite literally. Just like, if you ever looked at the history, it's quite freaky.
Presidents tied to corporations.
Yeah, like, if there was a president, then you would see their siblings and corporations. So quite literally.
Right. I mean, he's going to go on later to say something, which is that the bourgeoisie, or the political system, the state under the capitalist system, is a representation of the bourgeoisie. So that would make complete sense. But he's going to say that later on down. So yeah, I think all of that stuff ties in. All right. Does anybody else want to continue? Next paragraph.
I will.
Okay.
Before capitalist production, i.e. in the Middle Ages, the system of petty industry obtained generally based upon the private property of the laborers and their means of production in the country the agriculture of the small peasant, freeman, or serf. In the towns, the handicrafts organized in guilds. The instruments of labor, land, agricultural implements, the workshop, the tool, were the instruments of labor of single individuals, adapted for the use of one worker, and therefore, of necessity, small, dwarfish, circumscribed. But for this very reason, they belonged, as a rule, to the producer himself. To concentrate these scattered limited means of production, to enlarge them, to turn them into the powerful levers of production of the present day. This was precisely the historic role of capitalist production and of its upholder, the bourgeoisie. In the fourth section of Capital, Marx has explained in detail how, since the 15th century, this has been historically worked out through the three phases of simple cooperation, manufacture, and modern industry. But the bourgeoisie, as is shown there, could not transform these puny means of production into mighty productive forces without transforming them at the same time from means of production of the individual into social means of production, only workable by a collectivity of men. The spinning wheel, the hand loom, the blacksmith's hammer were replaced by the spinning machine, the power loom, the steam hammer. The individual workshop by the factory, implying the cooperation of hundreds and thousands of workmen. In like manner, production itself changed from a series of individual into a series of social acts, and the production from individual to social products. The yarn, the cloth, the metal articles that now come out of the factory were the joint product of many workers, through whose hands they had successively to pass before they were ready. No one person could say of them, I made that, this is my product.
Great. Would you want to continue?
Sure. But where in a given society the fundamental form of production is that spontaneous division of labor which creeps in gradually and not upon any preconceived plan, there the products take on the form of commodities whose mutual exchange, buying and selling, enable the individual producers to satisfy their manifold wants. And this was the case in the Middle Ages. The peasant sold to the artisan agricultural products and bought from him the products of handicraft. Into this society of individual producers, of commodity producers, the new mode of production thrust itself. In the midst of the old division of labor, grown up spontaneously and upon no definite plan, which had governed the whole of society, now arose division of labor upon a definite plan as organized in the factory. Side by side with individual production appeared social production. The products of both were sold in the same market and therefore at prices at least approximately equal. But organization upon a definite plan was stronger than spontaneous division of labor. The factories, working with the combined social forces of a collectivity of individuals, produced their commodities far more cheaply than the individual small producers. Individual producers succumbed in one department after another. Socialized production revolutionized all the old methods of production. But its revolutionary character was, at the same time, so little recognized that it was, on the contrary, introduced as a means of increasing and developing the production of commodities. When it arose, it found ready-made and made liberal use of certain machinery for the production and exchange of commodities, merchants' capital, handicraft, wage labor. Socialized production, thus introducing itself as a new form of the production of commodities, it was a matter of course that under it, the old forms of appropriation remained in full swing and were applied to its products as well.
Awesome. Give me 1 second real quick. Just making sure nobody else was trying to join. Okay. Does anybody want to talk about this at all? I mean, I feel like this is interesting. They're talking about the process of he's talking about the process where individual production gets kind of invaded by social production, and he'll kind of continue to go on talking about this more, so we don't really have to get into it right now, but I think it's interesting to realize the idea that you know, this sort of development of capitalism pushing individual producers out and kind of externalizing them and making socialized production kind of take over. We can see that happening still now. I mean, that development always continues. So sorry. I looked over here for a minute to see if anybody was trying to join, but I think we're in the medieval stage. Is that right? Yeah. All right. So I'm going to continue a little bit, unless anybody has any questions. All right. In the medieval stage of evolution of the production of commodities, the question as to the owner of the product of labor could not arise. The individual producer, as a rule, had, from raw material belonging to himself, and generally his own handiwork, produced it with his own tools, by the labor of his own hands or of his family. There was no need for him to appropriate the new product. It belonged wholly to him as a matter of course. His property in the product was, therefore, based upon his own labor. Even where external help was used, this was, as a rule, of little importance and very generally was compensated by something other than wages. The apprentices and journeymen of the guilds worked less for board and wages than for education in order that they might become master craftsmen themselves. Then came the concentration of the means of production and of the producers in large workshops and manufactories. Their transformation into actual socialized means of production and socialized producers. But the socialized producers and means of production and their products were still treated after this change just as they had been before, i.e. as the means of production and the products of individuals. Hitherto, the owner of the instruments of labor had himself appropriated the product, because as a rule it was his own product and the assistance of others was the exception. Now the owner of the instruments of labor always appropriated to himself the product, although it was no longer his product, but exclusively the product of the labor of others. Thus, the products now produced socially were not appropriated by those who had actually set in motion the means of production and actually produced the commodities, but by the capitalists. The means of production and production itself had become, in essence, socialized, but they were subjected to a form of appropriation which presupposes the private production of individuals, under which, therefore, everyone owns his own product and brings it to market. The mode of production is subjected to this form of appropriation, although it abolishes the conditions upon which the latter rests. Okay. This really an interesting development was, so now he's really showing how that second antagonism from the first chapter starts to form. It's this division between the fact that we're no longer individually producing our products, but we are still, the capitalists are still individually appropriating them once they've been produced, even though they didn't create them. So that is a characteristic of capitalist production. And that's what we see in a capitalist society. We see socialized production of things, and we see this individualistic appropriation by the owners of the factories, and the capitalists, the people who are paying those wage workers, are appropriating their products. So I think that makes sense. I mean, we all see that. Does anybody want to continue in the next part? Or does anybody want to talk about the last section?
I would like to bring up a point.
Yes.
This is Sharon. I was just thinking that, in the feudal period, there were the guys that did the stuff, I forget, I'm blocking on what they were called, the bourgeoisie or that class, not the serfs.
Or the lords.
Well, in between, the guys that did the crafts and everything, I'm blocking on their names.
Artisans, maybe.
Artisans, well, yeah, whatever they're called. And then most people were serfs. And, in his writing, Engels is trying to sort of to go from a serf to go to be a worker who's disconnected from what they've done. What is the kind of thinking of this group about themselves? Of, I think, he's writing to the workers, and he's trying to help them see their power. I'm just trying to sort it out in terms of how this goes forward in history. That's all. I know it's a little loose, but usually my thinking is, but so that's just all I wanted to say.
No, that's great. I think everything you're saying is kind of the material that he's working on here, from
Yeah.
what I get from it.
Yeah, this is Abayomi. I
Hey,
want to
Abiyumi.
comment.
Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Marx in the last 1/3 of the first volume of Capital talks about the dislocation of the peasantry because of the advances of the genesis of the capitalist system, you know, starting in the 15th century and onward. And people were torn away, you know, from their traditional societies and traditional relationships of production and thrust into urban areas. Even in rural areas, the role of the producers to the owners of the means of production, in that case being the land and perhaps the tools, shifted. So even though there may have been people in rural areas, they became more proletarianized than, let's say, as they would have contrarily been a peasantry. So I think Engels, the case he's building here in this third chapter, he's showing the potential for the transformation of the capitalist system, and that being, of course, the working class, which distinguishes utopian socialism from scientific socialism, that there is a class now that has come about over the last century and a half or more that has the capacity to organize at the point of production to overthrow the capitalist system. So I think he's outlining the evolving social character of production, which is the basis for a revolutionary transformation.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, the question then is, and I must be missing it, what is the force that changes the thinking in the serf, the serf kind of thinking into what you're saying is getting ready for a revolution, so to speak?
Would have to be in their work situation, their living situation, the degree to which they are being exploited and oppressed by the ruling class in their societies. And of course, this transforms your thinking. And when you move into an urban setting, it could even be transformed at a higher level because you're confronted with a whole new set of problems to deal with, whether it's housing, whether it is inadequate educational system, healthcare system, and those problems are still with us today in the 21st century. We see that clearly now in regard to the crisis that we're in. At least, 16 million people have been rendered unemployed over the last 3.5 weeks. 16 million people apply for unemployment benefits, which means that the unemployment rate is even higher because a lot of people couldn't get through. Some people don't qualify for unemployment. You got undocumented workers who can't apply and so forth. The healthcare system right now is being stretched to the limit because it is a privatized system by and large. And the way it functions, there's very little forward thinking in terms of how do you deal with a pandemic of this magnitude. So yeah, I think the transformation is continuing. You know, Engels wrote in the 19th century about these problems, and today, fundamentally, they still exist, even though they may have a different character.
can I say one more thing?
Yeah,
So
go ahead.
what I hear you saying is that the force is the anger of being so disenfranchised, the anger and seeing that the system is so unsupportive that brings the individual or the group to a revolutionary set of thoughts. Is that what I hear?
This is
Jerry.
David.
Oh, go ahead, David.
So people who are exploited are often angry in history and often rise up. A revolution, however, I think Engels showed, could only possible if the possibility exists to change the mode of production. And that wasn't always the case. There were peasant uprisings in France for hundreds of years. But it wasn't until the cities grew up with trade and manufacturing and something of a working class and a fairly powerful, at least financial bourgeoisie, that revolution could take place because they could overturn the lords and the nobility, the king, and institute a new system and let the peasants have land. In other words, they could decree land to the peasants and harness that anger. The anger alone is not enough. I think it was Marx or Engels wrote someplace about Spartacus and the slave rebellions.
Right.
They were very powerful in ancient Rome, but no matter how many military successes they had, they could not replace. There was nowhere for it to go in terms of overturning the system and creating a new system of production. Now, France, the land went to the peasants. In England, as far back, I think as 12 and 1300s, maybe 1400s, the nobility started pushing the peasants off the land and converting to sheep and other or more scientific methods of production that were more productive. However, the cities and the need for workers in the cities had not grown up. And Marx wrote about this in Capital, about a century or more where people just wandered, starving people wandered throughout England. And that was criminalized. And they were branded. The first time they were arrested for being vagrants, and then they were executed. So I think Marx talks about tens of thousands of expropriated peasants who wandered because they couldn't find any work in the cities. The demand hadn't developed yet. Tens of thousands who were hanged every year in England. So it wasn't just the anger that becomes a revolution. That's a part of it, but there has to be a potential for it to produce a new system. That's all.
Jerry, the other thing, though, I think that the key is, what is capitalist production based on? It's based on profit. So as the capitalists appropriate all the labor of the workers, they're appropriating on the basis of how to maximize their profit. Well, how do they maximize their profit? They maximize their profit by intensifying the exploitation of the workers, by lowering their wages, by replacing workers with machinery when it advances their interest to strengthen their competitive position and make more profit. And even the decisions on what are produced are decisions based on profit. They're not based, we have social production, but individual ownership, where the individual owners are only thinking how to maximize their profit. Look at the crisis we have today. We have the most developed society in the world, but they can't come up with medicine to deal with a crisis. Why can't they come up with it? Because each pharmaceutical company is thinking how to maximize their individual profit. Cuba comes up with a biotechnological field that's to surpass them in medicines. Why? Because it does it based on planning for human need, not based on profit. And that's the contradiction of capitalism, is that it's based on the individual appropriation of all the wealth of society, but it's the individual appropriation is based on a system where the interests of the individual appropriators are maximizing their profit at the expense of the whole of society, of the workers, and really of the entire world. And that's and that contradiction puts that small number of individual appropriators at conflict with virtually the whole world. And that's what produces a revolution. Nothing could be clearer than what we're going through right now. Come on, we're in the most developed society in the world. Why can't they get out of this crisis? Because they can't even produce respirators. They can't produce anything because they're all done individually by different corporations competing with each other that refuse to come together, that turn the U.S. against the rest of the world when it comes to deciding they can't cooperate with the other countries in developing medicines for an internal a worldwide pandemic because they want to control that production individually for their own profit. And that's the essence of capitalism. And the more and more the social relations of the world develop, and technology develops, and the needs of the people develop, the individual appropriation of wealth comes into conflict with them, and that makes revolution long overdue.
Great. So good. Also, Rebecca, I saw you put your hand up, and it sounds like Larry wants to say something. After that, Larry, you can go.
Thanks.
I wanted to mention that it's really based on ignorance versus knowledge and exploitation versus wanting to empower other people. Because that's really a power and control dynamic at its most basic level that's going on. And people who can empower themselves are not going to allow themselves to be exploited in such a way. They'll move away from the situation, whatever that might look like. I mean, I know this from personal experience from being an employee versus self-employed and going out there on my own. The dynamics are so I wanted to mention that breakdown really has to do a lot with how this process was changing with the machinery. It changed the way everyone lived, but it also made them more dependent on the society around them to provide that technological advancement. And I think that disempowered them as individuals in ways where they felt like in some ways they couldn't challenge the system or didn't know how to challenge the system. Like, for instance, if I want my own power right now, what do I do outside of DTE? You're brought up inside of this new technology. You don't know, you've lost some of the knowledge, the old knowledge of self-empowerment and communal living, and there's nothing there to replace that. So you have to start from scratch on your own and start to say, okay, how did they do it back in the day before all of this came along, before the exploitation via this technology and this capital began, and then take it back to formula. I mean, that's the only way I really feel like I've been able to survive is by saying, outside of all of these agencies that are trying to exploit, how can I empower myself and then show other people how to do that for themselves so that they can get out of that exploitation as well.
Nice.
Larry, yeah.
Yeah, well, Sharon's question was about how do people's thinking change, and the forces of capitalism are going to force people to become angry and resist, and at a certain point or points fight back. And it's in the course of the struggle that they learn the nature of the system that they're up against. And that's the role of the socialists, to help the working class understand the class nature of the system and what they can do to overcome it and build a new world. It's the people's ideas change in the course of struggle.
Thank you.
So
one other point, just to Rebecca's point, because it goes to what the essence of this whole book is about, is what utopian socialists believed was the answer to this alienation between production, the social production and individual ownership in the hands of the capitalists was to try to set up little utopian socialist models to answer it. And what Engels wrote on is that in many of these utopia socialists, it wasn't like they were full. I mean, they were sincere people, you know, they were trying to do something, you know, something different. But what Engels wrote on is that what a revolution is returning social production to social control. That because it's the masses of people who are producing everything, if you put the control of what we produce into the hands of the masses, it unleashes the individual energy and creativity of all the people, but in a way that can really answer the crisis and not find to try to compete little models to compete with the big, but to have the big serve everybody.
Can I say one more thing, Jason?
Go ahead.
Well, from this conversation, what I'm wondering about is if people would be willing to talk about it is we have the condition today that, you know, Bayomi and everybody else sort of alluded to, of the worst situation of capitalism ever. And how, as socialists, can we move forward now and help people to move closer towards changing the system during this horrible situation?
Thank you.
I want to
Yeah.
just add something. Can I interject?
Oh, yeah. Who's this? Oh, Sarah. Hi.
I don't know if this is exactly answer to your question, Sharon, but I want to mention before, and maybe this could be part of the solution, is this kind of jumping the gun a little bit as far as this book goes, but the whole financial collapse, we saw it back, 2008, 2009, and now we're seeing it again with the pandemic. It's important for people to understand that it's totally cyclical. And Engels talks about that in the book. He talks about it happens, I don't know if he was specifically talking about England or Germany. It happens just like clockwork about every decade. And so it's important for people to understand it's not that things are eventually just going to level out and things are going to fix themselves and we'll eventually find some kind of compromise where the bourgeoisie can, exist and not at our detriment. And that's what I think people need to understand. And I think that is what's going to wake people up, that it's not going to eventually just go away on its own.
Thank
you. Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, as we continue on, we're going to get to crises, which I think is really a good thing to talk about. It's one of these awesome things where even just starting out reading this text and just having a dialogue about it, we're kind of, our mental process here, we're developing in the same direction as that Engels does, I think, which is really cool. We should get back to it and get to the section of crises, which might add a little bit to the conversation. But yeah, I think it's really awesome how, we're already sort of getting there. I think maybe there's a couple more people that wanted to say something. I know Rebecca does, and then we should just get back into it. Rebecca, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I think that the stock market has a lot to do with that, because before the stock market was created, that wasn't possible, that whole crashing of the economy in such a way.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, I think with that, we should kind of continue on. Does anybody want to pick up the reading? I think Engels is about to go into a very, very analytical way of how crises happen and what they are. So does anybody want to volunteer?
I can read.
Okay.
Are we at the first capitalist?
This contradiction.
Okay. This contradiction, which gives to the new mode of production its capitalist character, contains the germ of the whole of the social antagonisms of today. The greater the mastery obtained by the new mode of production over all important fields of production in all manufacturing countries, the more it reduced individual production to an insignificant residuum, the more clearly was brought out the incompatibility of socialized production with capitalist appropriation. The first capitalists found, as we have said, alongside of other forms of labor, wage labor ready-made for them on the market, but it was exceptional, complementary, accessory, transitory wage labor. The agricultural laborer, though upon occasion he hired himself out by the day, had a few acres of his own land on which he could at all events live at a pinch. The guilds were so organized that the journeyman of today became the master of tomorrow. But all this changed as soon as the means of production became socialized and concentrated in the hands of capitalists. The means of production, as well as the product of the individual producer, became more and more worthless. There was nothing left for him but to turn wage worker under the capitalist. Wage labor, aforetime the exception and accessory, now became the rule and basis of all production. Aforetime complementary, it now became the sole remaining function of the worker. The wage worker for a time became a wage worker for life. The number of these permanent was further enormously increased by the breaking up of the feudal system that occurred at the same time, by the disbanding of the retainers of the feudal lords, the eviction of the peasants from their homesteads, etc. The separation was made complete between the means of production concentrated in the hands of the capitalist on the one side, and the producers possessing nothing but their labor power on the other. The contradiction between socialized production and capitalist appropriation manifested itself as the antagonism of proletariat and bourgeoisie. Sure. We have seen that the capitalist mode of production thrust its way into a society of commodity producers, of individual producers, whose social bond was the exchange of their products. But every society based upon the production of commodities had this peculiarity, that the producers have lost control over their own social interrelations. Each man produces for himself with such means of production as he may happen to have, and for such exchange as he may require to satisfy his remaining wants. No one knows how much of his particular article is coming on the market, nor how much of it will be wanted. No one knows whether his individual product will meet an actual demand, whether he will be able to make good his costs of production, or even to sell his commodity at all. Anarchy reigns in socialized production.
Okay, so I think we should just keep going because he's really just laying out just a step-by-step development of how capitalism begins to take hold. Does anybody want to continue, or I could go? Who would like to go?
Can I just make one quick comment?
Yeah.
That I think it's important also to note that when he talks about workers selling their labor power, what he's saying is that what that means is that a worker is nothing but a commodity who sells himself as a commodity to the capitalist who owns them, who owns him, his or her ability to work. And that's important, that we're nothing but commodities, no different than any other commodity.
Totally, absolutely. And I mean, I think that whole passage is really great in terms of recognizing this development between the wage worker sometimes versus the no institution of everybody works for wages like their whole life. I mean, that I think can hit home to a lot of people. I don't know, it hit home to me. All right, well, I'm going to just continue because we're going to get on to a more relevant part of this development, which is when the modes, when crises occur, and we're going to see how that develops. So I'm going to continue now. But the production of commodities, like every other form of production, has its peculiar inherent laws inseparable from it. And these laws work, despite anarchy, in and through anarchy. They reveal themselves in the only persistent form of social interrelations, i.e. in exchange. And here they affect the individual producers as compulsory laws of competition. They are at first unknown to these producers themselves and have to be discovered by them gradually and as the result of experience. They work themselves out, therefore, independently of the producers and in antagonism to them as inexorable natural laws of their particular form of production. The product governs the producers. In medieval society, especially in the earlier centuries, production was essentially directed towards satisfying the wants of the individual. It satisfied in the main only the wants of the producer and his family. Where the relations of personal dependence existed, as in the country, it also helped to satisfy the wants of the feudal lord. In all this, there was therefore no exchange. The products, consequently, did not assume the character of commodities. The family of the peasant produced almost everything they wanted, clothes and furniture, as well as the means of subsistence. Only when it began to produce more than was sufficient to supply its own wants and the payments in kind to the feudal lords, only then did it also produce commodities. This surplus, thrown into socialized exchange and offered for sale, became commodities. The artisan in the towns, it is true, had from the first to produce for exchange, but they also themselves supply the greatest part of their individual wants. They had gardens and plots of land. They turned their cattle out into the communal forest, which also yielded them timber and firing. The women spun flax, wool, and so forth. Production for the purpose of exchange, production of commodities, was only in its infancy. Hence, exchange was restricted, the market narrow, the methods of production stable. There was local exclusiveness without, local unity within, the mark in the country, in the town, the guild. Anybody want to jump in? Any questions? Somebody want to continue?
I can continue.
Okay.
But with the extension of the production of commodities, and especially with the introduction of the capitalist mode of production, the laws of commodity production, hitherto latent, came into action more openly and with greater force. The old bonds were loosened, the old exclusive limits broken through. The producers were more and more turned into independent, isolated producers of commodities. It became apparent that the production of society at large was ruled by absence of plan, by accident, by anarchy, and this anarchy grew to greater and greater height. But the chief means by aid of which the capitalist mode of production intensified this anarchy of socialized production was the exact opposite of anarchy. It was the increasing organization of production upon a social basis in every individual productive establishment. By this, the old, peaceful, stable condition of things was ended. Wherever this organization of production was introduced into a branch of industry, it brooked no other method of production by its side. The field of labor became a battleground. The great geographical discoveries and the colonization following them multiplied markets and quickened the transformation of handicraft into manufacture. The war did not simply break out between the individual producers of particular localities. The local struggles begat, in their turn, national conflicts, the wars of the 17th and 18th centuries. Finally, modern industry and the opening of the world market made the struggle universal, and at the same time gave it an unheard of virulence. Advantages in natural or artificial conditions of production now decide the existence of non-existence of individual capitalists, as well as of whole industries and countries. He that falls is remorselessly cast aside. It is the Darwinian struggle of the individual for existence transferred from nature to society with intensified violence. The conditions of existence natural to the animal appear as the final term of human development. The contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation now presents itself as an antagonism between the organization of production in the individual workshop and the production in society generally. Would you like me to keep going?
Sure, if you want to continue. If anybody wants to jump in, feel free. Just raise your hand.
Okay.
Want to keep going? Yeah.
The capitalistic mode of production moves in these two forms of the antagonism immanent of it from its very origin. It is never able to get out of that vicious cycle which Fourier had already discovered. Fourier could not, indeed, see in his time is that this circle is gradually narrowing, that the movement becomes more and more a spiral and must come to an end, like the movements of planets, by collision with the center. It is the compelling force of anarchy in the production of society at large that more and more completely turns the great majority of men into proletarians, and it is the masses of the proletariat, again, who will finally put an end to anarchy in production. It is the compelling force of anarchy in social production that turns the limitless perfectibility of machinery under modern industry into a compulsory law by which every individual industrial capitalist must perfect his machinery more and more under penalty of ruin. But the perfecting of machinery is making human labor superfluous, and the introduction and increase of machinery means the displacement of millions of manual by a few machine workers. Improvement in machinery means the displacement of more and more of the machine workers themselves. It means, in the last instance, the production of a number of available wage workers in excess of the average needs of capital, the formation of a complete industrial reserve army, as I called it in 1845, available at the times when industry is working at high pressure to be cast out upon the street, when the inevitable crash comes, a constant dead weight upon the limbs of the working class in its struggle for existence with capital, regulator for keeping wages down to the low level that suits the interests of capital. Thus, it comes about, to quote Marx, that machinery becomes the most powerful weapon in the war of capital against the working class, that the instruments of labor constantly tear the means of subsistence out of the hands of the laborer, that they, the very product of the worker, is turned into an instrument for his subjugation. Thus, it comes about that the economizing of the instruments of labor becomes at the same time from the outset the most reckless waste of labor power and robbery based upon the normal conditions under which labor functions, that machinery. The most powerful instrument for shortening labor time becomes the most unfailing means for placing every movement of the laborer's time and that of his family at the disposal of the capitalist for the purpose of expanding the value of his capital. Thus, it comes about that the overwork of some becomes the preliminary condition for the idleness of others, and that modern industry, which hunts after new consumers over the whole world, forces the consumption of the masses at home down to a starvation minimum, and in doing thus destroys its own home market. The law that always equilibrates the relative surplus population or industrial reserve army to the extent and energy of accumulation, this law rivets the laborer to capital more firmly than the wedges of Vulcan did Prometheus to the rock. It establishes an accumulation of misery corresponding with the accumulation of capital. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is, therefore, at the same time accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole, i.e., on the side of the class that produces its own product in the form of capital. And to expect any other diversion of the products from the capitalist mode of production is the same as expecting the electrodes of a battery not to decompose acidulated water, not to liberate oxygen at the positive, hydrogen at the negative pole, so long as they are connected with the battery.
Great. Can I maybe we'll just pause for 1 second there?
Absolutely.
Great. Awesome. Thanks for reading all that.
No problem.
I just want to say that I really love this last paragraph that you read, because this text is called Utopian Socialist and Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Engels is putting forward a scientific socialism, and there's nothing clearer that he's really trying to define himself as a scientist, that he's defining the way capitalism works is similar to the way a battery works, and he's talking about chemistry and stuff like that. And I think it's just really kind of a nice little thing to just realize how scientific Engels really views his own analysis at this moment, and Marx as well, obviously, who he quoted several times. Marx, they really see themselves as scientists, and they're analyzing scientifically how capitalism came about and how it works. And it's really it's not these ideas or philosophies, it's just basic science based on a materialism. And I just think that's really, really cool and really worth noting.
Can I say something? I just said, think about it. This was written over 100 years ago. But that's why this is a scientific method. Look at how this describes today. We have robots and all this new forms of technology and all this automation. And yet people are working more for less. Instead of working 20 or 30 hours a week, the technology being used to benefit society, it's used as a weapon against the workers. I mean, this is what they were describing this 100 years ago, but that's the case today. There are even socialist groups who say, well, there's no more working class because of technology, like this is a new thing, technology. But Engels and Marx, they understood that dynamic, because that's the dynamic of capitalism. They want to increase exploitation, and the way a boss gets the advantage over his fellow boss is they can, introduce new technology. But it's a contradiction, because it reduces their rate of profit, so it intensifies exploitation. Think about it. This was 100-year. This is so alive today. And the other thing is, I think what Sarah made a very good point, that the capitalist crisis repeats itself, but in the current world where you have the destruction of the entire environment by the hands of the capitalists, the crises have a social dynamic that's intertwined with the destruction of society. I think that's what we see with these viruses. So it makes the normal crises of capitalism through overproduction even more intense, because they're combined with literally the destruction of humanity in many ways. And under capitalism, what's their answer to it? I mean, Trump says this country shouldn't get masks because we should get the mask. He wears this Buy America hat at press conferences in pandemic, or this country, we can't, they're starving out countries, are intensifying sanctions against countries at a time when it cries out for international cooperation. What irrationality. I mean, look at the system, it's completely irrational. So if you go in the modern era, we've advanced we're so overripe for a fucking revolution that the crises are getting so untenable. And I really think the current crisis, as terrible as it is, and what's going to flow from it, because it ain't going to end once we all start going, a certain number of people go back to work, because millions ain't going back to work. And the cities are all going to be bankrupt, and the pension funds are going to be bankrupt, because someone's going to pay for all this stuff. It's going to intensify the struggle, and it's going to raise the question of capitalism being an irrational system to so many more people, and we have to bring it out. I think it's the perfect time to intensify our understanding, and that we have an ideologically and a scientific approach that speaks to the current period.
Yeah, thank you.
I also wanted to add something to that. I liked the analogy they were talking about, almost the cyclical nature, like narrowing it into like a spiral, which also kind of scientific in a way. It just, these lapses of time between crises is becoming shorter and shorter and shorter. So that's what, and also it's a huge environmental factor now too, that is even more extreme than it was back then, where, resources are going to run out because of overproduction. There's not going to be a choice. And people often talk about, like, yeah, revolution, we're going to overthrow the bourgeoisie. But I think people kind of overlook the fact that there's not going to be much more bourgeoisie left by that point. I don't think that, and I mean, I'm going on, and obviously there's more to be read, but I think that's one thing that people don't realize. At least the people I talk to, of course, you guys, I'm sure, have read other literature on this, but there's so many people, I think Marx talks about this too, about the people fluctuating back and forth between being, have-nots and having things, being technically considered bourgeoisie, but they're like small capitalists.
No, that's a good point.
Very good point. He talks about that here. I mean, I think we went through it briefly, I think, a little earlier, which was the increasing development and the competition between capitalists. And Jerry was talking about, like, how do you get a advantage over another capitalist? You have to keep innovating and keep coming up with new technology. And like you were talking about, Jerry, too. It's like one thing that comes to my mind is these automated checkouts, right? Like an automated checkout, there's one worker there for every like four checkout machines, and they just have to come and just fix it if it goes wrong. And one store gets that, and then that's an advantage to them, and then they can take over the smaller mom and pops, because those shops can't afford that. And it's he's even saying here that it's like you have to do that if you want to continue it doesn't even matter whether you like automated checkouts or not. If you're a capitalist, you've got to keep coming up with ways to keep continuing, or else you're going to get picked off, you know, in this process of competition, which eventually gets forward into the competition gives way to monopoly, which is where we're going to go next. I mean, that's what he starts to get into, and also talking about, again, crises. But yeah, I mean, there's so many good points that I think everyone can relate to what we personally experience all the time.
Also, not to be long-winded here, but what you added onto that is I think it's important for people to realize a lot of people say, just don't go to the self-checkout line, and somehow that's going to fix the problem. And I think what you say is, like, some people don't see the forest for the trees. They're not seeing that the problem is you don't have a choice in the system that we're under. It's like, yeah, it's either complete ruin for you and your business. If you don't compete, you don't really have much of a choice. It's either you are an oppressor or you're the oppressed. And I think that's why you have so much of that fluctuation going on.
Right, thank you. Okay, so does anybody else want to add anything, or should we continue? Does somebody want to read?
I'll read.
Okay.
We've seen that the ever-increasing perfectibility of modern machinery is, by the anarchy of social production, turned into a compulsory law that forces the individual industrial capitalist always to improve his machinery, always to increase its productive force. The bare possibility of extending the field of production is transformed for him into a similarly compulsory law. The enormous expansive force of modern industry, compared with which that of gases is mere child's play, appears to us now as a necessity for expansion, both qualitative and quantitative, that laughs at all resistance. Such resistance is offered by consumption, by sales, by the markets, for the products of modern industry, but the capacity for extension, extensive and intensive of the markets is primarily governed by quite different laws that work much less energetically. The extension of the markets cannot keep pace with the extension of production. The collision becomes inevitable, and as this cannot produce any real solution so long as it does not break in pieces the capitalist mode of production, the collisions become periodic. Capitalist production has begotten another vicious circle. As a matter of fact, since 1825, when the first general crisis broke out, the whole industrial and commercial world, production and exchange among all civilized peoples and their more or less barbaric hangers-on, are thrown out of joint about once every 10 years. Commerce is at a standstill, the markets are glutted, products accumulate as multitudinous as they are unsaleable, hard cash disappears, credit vanishes, factories are closed, the mass of the workers are in want of the means of subsistence because they have produced too much of the means of subsistence. Bankruptcy follows upon bankruptcy, execution upon execution. The stagnation lasts for years, productive forces and products are wasted and destroyed wholesale until the accumulated mass of commodities finally filter off, more or less depreciated in value, until production and exchange gradually begin to move again. Little by little, the pace quickens, it becomes a trot. The industrial trot breaks into a canter, the canter in turn grows into the headlong gallop of a perfect steeplechase of industry, commercial credit, and speculation, which finally, after breakneck leaps, ends where it began, in the ditch of a crisis. And so over and over again. We have now, since the year 1825, gone through this 5 times, and at the present moment, 1877, we are going through it for the 6th time. And the character of these crises is so clearly defined that Fourier hit all of them off when he described the first crisis plethorique, a crisis from plethora.
Great. I think it'd be good to do another brief pause here. That was a really great passage. I don't know if other people really enjoyed it as much as I did, but I mean, when I first read this, I was kind of blown away by the fact that, as Jerry said, this thing written over 100 years ago has pretty much worked out the fact that one of these crises happens every 10 years. And it already had happened 5 times, and it was the 6th one when it was being written. And that was figured out by him over 100 years ago. And not only that, but the Fourier, who he is referencing in chapter 1, who I think was like at least 50 years before him, or 100 years before, even Fourier had recognized this. I mean, this idea of what he called the crisis plethorique, or a crisis from plethora, has been figured out already. And to me, it's, as somebody living in the 21st century, I read this maybe a year ago. It's just mind-boggling to think like this has been deduced. We have already understood that capitalism produces these crises as a regular course of its continuation. I mean, I think when I first wrote this, I took a side note and I wrote that, you know, capitalism, to me, it almost resembles like a car that like keeps stalling. Like you drive it and it just keeps flooding. The engine just keeps flooding and it keeps shutting off, but then you just keep hitting the ignition again and just go a little bit further. And it's like we've been just churning down the road this way since capitalism started, and it's just a natural characteristic of the system. It's just going to keep happening. It's ridiculous, you know. It's ridiculous that we wouldn't want to change it, but that is how it works.
Can I say something?
Yeah, and also then Derek wants to say something.
Well, what I've been thinking about as we're talking is one of the biggest difficulties we have is the collapse of the Soviet Union and the American branding of communism as a failed state. In that, you know, they did the same thing to Bernie, like even the Democrats, everybody did it, you know, like, well, this has failed, this is not going to work. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really hard for us to get our information, for people to listen to it, because I think they have in their mind communism doesn't work, the economic system doesn't work. And we haven't, I don't think, at least I couldn't refute that. I wouldn't know. I've tried, but I really haven't been successful. That's it.
Yeah, I feel that. Derek, you're still muted, by the way, Derek.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there's some really annoying background noise, and whoever that is, could they like put themselves on mute, because it's really annoying. That's it.
Okay, maybe everybody mute unless you're talking. Thank you.
I was just gonna say, a lot of this it's almost nuts that this is to a T of how things went in 08 and are now happening again, like to an exact T. And I just think that's so nuts that like a lot of people will just diss off Engels as, oh, someone from 100 years ago, but he's laying things out in front of us that, you know, happened last week are like happening right now and continue to happen. And if we don't recognize this, like, we're just going to continue in this path of like blindness. And so I just think it's really nuts that you know, we have this piece of literature that just lays out the path before us of how things have happened and how things are going to continue to happen if we don't change. And I just think that's really nuts.
Yeah, I think, Sharon, to your point that you made earlier about how people kind of have this predisposition to not trust the idea of socialism or communism because it's written off as a failed state. I think this passage serves as a really solid example, at least for me reading it. We're talking about the relevancy that it still holds today and just like how we can see the parallels now even. And I think like that's like a great place to start with people, is to put this, to frame it now, is like think about 08 and then think about what we're going through now. For a lot of people, they've been through generations before that and before that, because I'm still only 22, so my frame of reference is just those two most recent ones. But for other people, there's like decades, there's like most of your lifetime that you've had to continue watching this. And I think that's a big thing that can really kind of draw people out of that feedback loop of, oh, socialism is bad and communism is bad for X, Y, and Z. And it can be like, well, I'm not exactly living the best that I possibly could under capitalism.
David?
Yeah. So I want to strike a more positive note, more optimistic note. I don't think we're going to have that. Those problems are that sharp. The majority, look at the whole Bernie movement was young people for socialism, as they understood it. But that's natural. Well, there's no big communist movement here, revolutionary movement in this country. It's fragmented and it's very sad, but that's where it is. But there's a spontaneous developing, which is what Engels said. This stuff can't happen unless new ideas filter in, has become reasonable. That which was unreasonable is becoming reasonable. So the majority of young people, they say, favor socialism. Now, they have to gain a lot of experience and struggle, and that hasn't happened yet. And unfortunately, Sanders's campaign, ended, and I'm certain he's backing the Democratic Party. And a lot of people will be dragged into that, but a lot of people may be open to the idea that why would we support a right-wing Democrat against a right-wing Republican? And so we have to, a lot of what we do, I mean, we're having this class and we have a bunch of classes coming up, and we've been studying, trying to understand it. But our job, I think, Larry Christensen said, our job is going to be to figure out ways of turning that into struggle, showing people that we can tackle some of these problems. This crisis is not going to be paid for by the capitalist class. They are rushing trillions of dollars, some of it filtering down to the working class, so not a lot, to try to keep them alive. They have to keep the workers alive if you're going to be able to exploit them later. So it's literally a life and death question. But they don't intend to pay for this crisis. They intend to smash the standard of living of the mass of the people, ruin the middle class more than it's been ruined, ruin the working class, extract more and more surplus. They will shift that burden. And, we're used to seeing things in a certain way, and then we saw the housing crisis and water crisis. This is going to be 10, 100 times more intense. And that's where new ideas will become real. Because Hegel wrote, the real becomes rational, and the rational becomes real. We can explain, the real becomes rational. What's really out here, we can explain. Engels is doing that. Well, what's rational in people's minds, these new ideas, this socialist idea, this communist idea of cooperation, of medical care, of guaranteed income, which was all, now it's going to become more and more real. The rational becomes real in minds of people. And that's when revolutions can actually occur, when they need it and it becomes reasonable and rational for them. That's all.
Yeah, can I just make one comment just in terms of what Sharon said? While I was off, I read 2 books. One was The Socialist Manifesto by this guy who was a founder of Jacobin. And it is true that he tries to keep everyone away from communist ideology by negating the gains of the socialist revolution and negating Leninism. But to counter that was the book that Abayumi resurfaced and put out for people to read, was Walter Rodney's book on the Russian Revolution, a view, history of the Russian Revolution, a view from the Third World. And I'd recommend it to anybody, because it's a tremendous defense of the Soviet Union and what was gained in the Soviet Union, and how the Soviet Union was able to develop based on planning for human need and a rational society, was able to go from the least developed of the capitalist world to a country that rivaled US imperialism. And we have a lot of works that can explain what led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it doesn't mean that we negate what was accomplished. And I think it was a great thing that Abayumi pulled out this work by Rodney, who was a theoretician from the Marxist from the Third World. And it's a great book, and it really is an answer to that. And it's written from the point of view of a communist from the developing world.
Is there any chance that we can read that as a group?
Well,
Yeah, I had suggested that a few weeks ago, before this crisis we're in now. So yeah, looking forward. Yeah, I think we could read it. It's pretty extensive work, but we could read it section, of each chapter. He gets into the actual history of the Russian Revolution, and he gets into the theoretical, historical debates about the Russian Revolution. It's quite interesting. So, yeah, I think that's something we could definitely do in the future, because this is critical right now. And if we look at, for example, Sanders, his statement earlier this week, the question is, he said he didn't see a way forward in terms of getting a nomination. But at this point, I don't think the votes are that important. We don't even know how relevant the elections are going to be in another 7 months. Yeah, because the U.S. and the world has been thrown into a deep crisis. So how that's going to play out could very well not be in the electoral arena. It could be in other aspects, because now we got millions and millions of people out of work. The healthcare system is in crisis. Education, it's going to be really, really serious.
That's good. It's helpful.
Does anybody else want to chime in? We've got people that haven't said anything. It is a good conversation point. I think we're talking about what's going on right now. We're talking about Bernie. We're talking about economic crisis. A lot of interesting ideas coming in.
This is Mike. Yeah, I'm actually somewhat optimistic, even though things look really bad right now from, because all of us, our neighbors, are suffering from a growing lack of things that we need just to live day to day. But the ruling class is worried, and I think we should pay particular note of that. They're spending a lot of time actually attacking Cuba. They're any country, especially small country that's not real strong economically, that tries to use Cuban or does use Cuban medical workers from the Reeve Brigade. They're being pressured and threatened to back away from that. The U.S. really fears the cooperation, which is the basis of socialism, the cooperation worldwide that's growing to fight this pandemic. And they're belittling the efforts that China is doing now and sending aid all around the world. China has sent now medical aid to 80 countries around the world, and the U.S. wants to belittle all of that. So I think, and what we see in the United States is a growing, again, interest in things going on in Cuba because of its revolutionary tradition and what it can teach us and how to organize society. So there's a side of me that's very optimistic. I think a number of us have been on conference calls with other groups that are issue oriented around the environment, around housing, around prisoner issues. And what I find, and I think other comrades have found, is that there is a shift to the left. The kinds of ideas that just 6 months ago were considered sort of fringe ideas are being pushed now. People aren't talking about a moratorium on evictions. They're saying we shouldn't have to pay the rent for the next few months. That's a pretty radical idea. And that idea was raised in the New York Times a week or two ago in an op-ed piece by two professors. And they actually said that for the big landlords, they're just going to have to eat the losses. So this is in the New York Times. So this is what this crisis has done. People are really examining things. The word moratorium is used everywhere now to address the one way to deal with the shortages of everything that's happening to us now. Really, so I'm hopeful. Maybe I'm suffering from illusions by going on these conference calls. Maybe I'm in the bubble, as they say. But I was in that bubble 6 months ago, and that bubble wasn't anywhere where it is today. So I think we can do something. I'm optimistic about our efforts to get Cuban medicine introduced into the US. I'm optimistic because I think a lot of liberals will want to join in with us in this. And, you know, Jerry was telling me about a call with the environmentalists who are pushing, you know, the struggle against DTE. And, you know, the acceptable demands now 6 months ago would have been radical. So we got to get in there, you know, and then help organize the thought, help organize and create a mass popular ideology that guides us forward. And I think we can do it.
That's great. Did anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, sorry for rejoining back in the call. I had to go somewhere. But yeah, no, sorry, I need to see your
No
name.
problem.
God dang
I
it,
can,
Zoom.
we can hear you.
Oops, sorry, what you said?
We hear you.
Yeah, no, I share, Mr. Shane's, optimism and whatnot. And I hope I'm not also delusional myself as someone that's radically, well, probably one of the younger members of this call right now. And anyways, to chime in, what, Mr. Shane was just talking about, like environmentalists and people calling for extended payment to rent and whatnot. McDonald, this is from the InTheSetTimes.com. McDonald's strikes demands, like a $3 per hour additional hazards pay, protective equipment, 2 weeks sick pay for quarantine, and like a coronavirus healthcare guarantee. And one of the organizers, Maria Ruiz, said, "We are essential workers, but my life is essential too." So like we are seeing a radical shift of consciousness happening. Where earlier everybody felt more like a robot. That's where the word robotnik comes from. It basically comes from the Slovakian word for worker and whatnot. And now we're seeing the human sensibilities coming back to life and demanding that they be treated as humans and not treated as a mere expendable unit to help generate just another penny for the capitalist class and whatnot. And I didn't know if because I was gone for a bit, and like I jumped into the middle of this conversation. I don't know if we reconnected it back to the earlier parts of this chapter, but I'm just gonna quote it again because it seems a bit, acceptable. From the very beginning of chapter 3, this is again talking about economics and whatnot. Christ, where is it? I just had it. Where Engels was talking about reason becoming unreason. Oh, here it is. They're to be sought, not in the philosophy, but in the economics of each particular epoch. The growing perception that existing social institutions are unreasonable and unjust. That reason has become unreason, and right, wrong. And Engels goes on and then eventually catches up to where we are currently in the reading. But yes, I wanted to connect it back to the beginning of the work because I think we've been hitting that, quote every single time each one of us have been talking. And we really need to capitalize on that when everyone sees, capitalism's irrationality. And we need to promote the rationality of socialism as well as its ability to capitalize on our interests as a class, as a proletarian class. We need to really start uniting all these movements from the red strikers all the way to the McDonald workers, because quite literally, if we don't capture on this, we're missing on a massive revolutionary wave we can definitely use to help the entire world. But that's just me. And hopefully I'm not delusional.
Hopefully.
Can you just say where you're from?
Right now I'm in Missouri, just like 2 hours below St. Louis, or sorry, to the south of St. Louis.
Okay. Who do you work with?
Right now, I'm basically in my parents' home, so
Okay,
I'm
sure.
basically unemployed.
Okay, no, I didn't mean to probe. I thought your comments were very good.
Thank you for them. Yes.
Victoria
sure.
works with us through the ULF with Jackson and I. We're all pretty good friends, and yeah, so we've done a lot of work together and had a lot of really good discussions there.
I agree.
Nice. No, thank you for the information also about the McDonald's strikers. I was not aware of that, and it's all very encouraging. I'm happy to hear about that.
Yeah, could
Yeah.
I comment?
Yes.
Real quick. Yeah, I think we need to pay attention to these rumblings that are going on in the labor movement. A lot of them in the South. We have them here at Beaumont Hospital. Yeah, the McDonald workers, their lives are being threatened because they're designated as essential. The restaurant workers, for carryouts and deliveries, but they need that personal protective equipment. They need adequate pay. And some of these firms now, they're even denying just basic benefits to people who are still working. So, these are demands we need to continue to pay attention to and raise.
Yeah, I wanted to share. I'm actually in New York right now, and every evening at 7 o'clock, I hear the applause and cheering and banging pots and pans, which is a nightly occurrence that is meant to celebrate the heroes of this health crisis, those essential workers that we rely on, those same people who earn the lowest wages and of whom we don't even want to give $15, even a livable wage, are now being celebrated every evening by applause from these people that are quarantined in their homes. And I even see this in commercials too. I saw a Dunkin' Donuts commercial that said like heroes, and it talked about like all the heroes, the garbage workers, and even their own employees, and this big word hero. We're brandishing that word around, but we're not doing anything material to actually protect them in any way. So yeah, it's a very big rumbling potential. I feel like I agree with Abiyumi.
Yeah, I mean, at Beaumont Hospital, they put forward a document, calling for housing allowances, because if people are working in those areas, they need places to go really outside their households. I mean, it's like being at war. Like if you're on the battlefield every day and then you have to go home, it's a very intense situation. So they were asking for more pay, housing allowances, personal protective equipment, the hiring of more staff. I mean, this shows what the privatization of healthcare has done in the United States. Like Duggan, you see him on the news talking about, the problems in the city, but he was the person as CEO who privatized the Detroit Medical Center. And all the problems at Sinai Grace Hospital, they've been, they fired a nurse, some others were sent home for protesting what's going on at the hospital. So they're making profits out of, all these crises, and they want to make more profits and be propped up by the government, which is, our tax dollars.
Can I just make one comment on Sanders too? I do think that while there are a lot of people that are demoralized by what happened to Sanders, with Sanders, I think there's a lot of youth that are pissed about what happened with Sanders. And the demoralized elements and the elements there's going to be a lot of those elements that are going to, say, well, we got to go back to the Democrats. And that's what Sanders himself is saying. But I think there's a lot of people who supported Sanders who don't accept that bullshit and are looking for what happened and are looking for a more left alternative. And that's why we got to reach out to them. I really believe that. I've been finding that in comments and that I think there might be a heightened interest to revolutionary ideology. Because what we have to say to people is, look, this isn't to attack Sanders, but wasn't it inevitable what happened with Sanders? Did anyone really believe that the Democratic Party was going to be a vehicle for social change? It's an imperialist party, and it always has been. And what's really needed, and the idea that capitalism can be reformed through a political revolution negates the social essence of capitalism. What really is needed is a social revolution. I think there's a lot of opening. We don't have to bring it out by just denouncing Sanders and all that, but we can bring it out by showing that alternative. And I got a feeling this is a time to be aggressive with revolutionary ideology, to find those elements that will move to the left. I think a sector of the Sanders movement will move to the right, but a sector will be looking to move to the left as well.
Awesome. I actually just was taking some notes. I just want to mention that as we're coming up on 4 o'clock, this overall group is meant to be 3 hours, which even that is kind of long for people sometimes. We may not be getting through this reading, but I think that the conversation that's already coming out of it is really important, and hopefully people will want to go back and continue the reading on their own if we don't. But I'm just writing down some things we talked about in terms of real concrete things we might want to do in order to take advantage of this moment. Mike talked about Cuba outreach that I think is a really important thing to think about. A little bit of a callback to that because as he said, like they developed their entire biotech sector simultaneously along with the capitalist biotech sector, but at the same time, and what they've developed with it is astonishing, and just the unreason, as we were talking about before, of not utilizing that just to help each other, it just doesn't make sense to people. So reaching out and highlighting the stupidity of not reaching out to them, I think is a really good thing to work on. We've got McDonald's strikes and other essential workers agitation as a thing, and Jerry brought up reaching out to Sanders supporters, because I think it's totally agree. As somebody who supported Sanders big time in 2016, I was like, this is something that we all of the supporters, we got ourselves really attached to the idea that this is the thing that we really need. And just to say, oh, well, that's all going to go away, I think that's just going to leave a disillusionment and an opportunity for us to reach out. So, anybody who can connect and bring in Sanders supporters that are feeling very heartbroken and disillusioned, I think we should bring that into does anybody else have ideas of like what we should be doing now, like in this moment?
Well, I just wanted to say briefly, I think it's an opening as well for new ideas and new approaches. This crisis has laid bare the contradictions of the U.S. capitalist system for all to see. It is still not a path clear forward for U.S. imperialism at this point. The $2.2 trillion stimulus package is weighted heavily, towards the banks and the corporations. Giving the worker $1,200, possibly, those who qualify for it, is not going to solve their problem even in 30 days. The unemployment, 16 million people filing for unemployment, and there's a situation where people are not able to even get through. There's so many people applying for unemployment. So it's far more than the 16 to 17 million that's been announced. And those who don't qualify, undocumented workers who can't apply for unemployment, many of them, they don't have Social Security numbers, they don't have the necessary papers to receive that compensation. So this is a real crisis for capitalism. What are they going to do? Can they come up with another $2 trillion? Would that be adequate? So, I think we really need to be thinking long term. We got to deal tactically with the current situation. These classes are great because it shows, we're still thinking along these lines. And even when we go back to meeting in a closed setting, we could still have these platforms available for people who are outside the city to participate in these type of discussions. But we really need to be thinking strategically as well. How are we going to intervene in this crisis? Millions of people unemployed. The cities, the facade that's been promoted here in Detroit, it's a major setback. Dugan even said, I think yesterday or day before yesterday, this crisis is blowing $100 million deficit in the budget, a hole in the budget. That's how it was described, I think, by the Free Press or the Detroit News. So they're going to be looking to take that away from the working class, as oppressed and marginalized as it is now in Detroit. So we have to be out there fighting and defending our people.
Not if we boycott. We're already all sitting here, aren't we? Just don't get up. It's pretty simple.
I also wanted to offer another piece of information I recently read. Apparently, a third of all renters in the country didn't pay rent in April. I saw that in Wall Street Journal. So we'll see what happens in May as well, and see what that turns into. And it may be people not able to pay rent. It may be people saying, I forget rent. I'm in such a terrible situation. I'm not gonna, maybe they whatever the reason is, they're not paying it. So we'll see what happens next. And maybe we should be getting involved in rent striking and organizing that as well. That would be another thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, the moratorium on evictions should be indefinite at this point, even in terms of rent. Because, I mean, if there are hundreds of thousands of people thrown into the streets, even millions, what is that going to do for the public health status of the majority of people here in this country? It's going to worsen it.
Yeah, big time. And we would have to see. I mean, I've been saying over and over, just privately, that I don't think that the ruling class is going to let half of the renters in the country be all out on the street on June 1st or whatever it is, because the outcome of that, I think they'd be very afraid of. But we'll see. I don't know what's going to happen. All right. Well, so should we get back to the reading? What do folks want to do? Does anybody have more? I think this has been a great discussion, but we might want to see if we can chip away more at this reading. Do folks agree? Okay. I'm just going to continue here, and people can take over from me if they want. In these crises, the contradiction between socialized production and capitalist appropriation ends in a violent explosion. The circulation of commodities is, for the time being, stopped. Money, the means of circulation, becomes a hindrance to circulation. All the laws of production and circulation of commodities are turned upside down. The economic collision has reached its apogee. The mode of production is in rebellion against the mode of exchange. The fact that the socialized organization of production within the factory has developed so far that it has become incompatible with the anarchy of production in society, which exists side by side with and dominates it, is brought home to the capitalists themselves by the violent concentration of capital that occurs during these crises. Through the ruin of many large and a still greater number of small capitalists, the whole mechanism of the capitalist mode of production breaks down under the pressure of the productive forces, its own creations. It is no longer able to turn all this mass of means of production into capital. They lie fallow, and for that very reason, the industrial reserve army must also lie fallow. Means of production, means of subsistence, available laborers, all the elements of production and of general wealth are present in abundance, but abundance becomes the source of distress and want, Fourier, because it is the very thing that prevents the transformation of the means of production and subsistence into capital. For in capitalistic society, the means of production can only function when they have undergone a preliminary transformation into capital, into the means of exploiting human labor power. The necessity of this transformation into capital of the means of production and subsistence stands like a ghost between these and the workers. It alone prevents the coming together of material and personal levers of production. It alone forbids the means of production to function, the workers to work and live. On the one hand, therefore, the capitalistic mode of production stands convicted of its own incapacity to further direct these productive forces. On the other, these productive forces themselves, with increasing energy, press forward to the removal of the existing contradiction, to the abolition of their quality as capital, to the practical recognition of their character as social production forces. By the way, I really love this one line where he says that the capitalistic mode of production stands convicted of its own incapacity to further direct these productive forces. I feel like, and this is what we've been talking about, right now, we are seeing the capitalist mode of production convicted of its own incapacities right now. You know, and it's that's what makes this so relevant. All right, I'm going to continue on, unless anyone, no. This rebellion of the productive forces, as they grow more and more powerful against their quality as capital, this stronger and stronger command that their social character shall be recognized, forces the capital class itself to treat them more and more as social productive forces, so far as this is possible under capitalist conditions. The period of industrial high pressure, with its unbounded inflation of credit, not less than the crash itself by the collapse of great capitalist establishments, tends to bring about that form of the socialization of great masses of the means of production which we meet with in the different kinds of joint stock companies. Many of these means of production and of distribution are, from the outset, so colossal that, like the railways, they exclude all other forms of capitalistic expansion. At a further stage of evolution, this form also becomes insufficient. The producers on a large scale in a particular branch of an industry, in a particular country, unite in a trust, a union for the purpose of regulating production. They determine the total amount to be produced, parcel it out among themselves, and thus enforce the selling price fixed beforehand. But trusts of this kind, as soon as business becomes bad, are generally liable to break up, and on this very account compel a yet greater concentration of association. The whole of a particular industry is turned into one gigantic stock company, joint stock company. Internal competition gives place to the internal monopoly of this one company. This has happened in 1890 with the English alkali production, which is now, after the fusion of 48 large works in the hands of one company, conducted upon a single plan and with a capital of £6 million. So this whole section is important to just understand the development of how, with these crises, we see a monopolization of capitalist industries into bigger companies and eventually sort of trust companies. And then he starts to get into this nationalization, which I think is also something interesting to talk about in a moment of crisis, like this idea of the state having to take control of an industry. And I wonder if anyone wants to start a conversation about that, or
well, yeah, this is Abayomi. Yeah, the Tennessee Valley Authority, for example, during the Great Depression and the New Deal programs under Franklin Roosevelt, was constructed in that whole methodology. But it didn't, all those programs were great. And we've advocated those programs, particularly during the Great Recession starting in 2007, 2008. But we also advocated the need to actually, build revolutionary organization. And, but yes, that could be an option for the capitalist system. I don't know if it's too late for them for that option. But I mean, the logic is there. I mean, you look at Trump, in terms of this whole stimulus package, they didn't want to do it. But the reason why they want to do it is because they want to shore up the system, to bolster the corporations and the banks and to maintain social order. But I wouldn't be surprised if they do come up with schemes along those lines, but I don't know if they're capable of carrying them out. That's another question. If we look at what's happened in the last month, their response to this crisis raises, the capacity of the system to do that.
Another example was during the housing and finance crisis in the late 2000s, the federal government essentially nationalized the mortgage industry. They took over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are the backstop for all the mortgages. And it's owned by the government. And the effect of it, though, there was a nationalization, but who benefited from it? It was a nationalization to benefit the banks. And what it meant was that when the banks would foreclose on people's homes on fraudulent mortgages, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government, paid them the full value of the mortgages, and most of the evictions were carried out by the government, by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That's what we were finding. So that was an example. That's why, nationalization of it in itself isn't our demand. We're for nationalization under workers' control. And that's what we were for, that we want to nationalize the banks but put them under the control of the working class, because nationalization can be used in a period of crisis by the bourgeoisie to take control in order to bail out the capitalist class. And when they bail out the capitalist class, it's at the expense of the workers and the oppressed every time.
Yeah. Can anyone read, or I'll read the next section, and then we could maybe continue this conversation, because he really is about to say it right now.
I'll continue.
Okay.
In the trusts, freedom of competition changes into its very opposite, into monopoly, and the production without any definite plan of capitalistic society capitulates to the production upon a definite plan of the invading socialistic society. Certainly, this is so far still to the benefit and advantage of the capitalists. But in this case, the exploitation is so palpable that it must break down. No nation will put up with production conducted by trusts with so barefaced an exploitation of the community by a small band of dividend mongers. In any case, with trust or without, the official representative of capitalist society, the state, will ultimately have to undertake the direction of production. This necessity for conversion into state property is felt first in the great institutions for intercourse and communication, the post office, the telegraphs, the railways. If the crises demonstrate the incapacity of the bourgeoisie for managing any longer modern productive forces, the transformation of the great establishments for production and distribution into joint stock companies, trusts, and state property show how unnecessary the bourgeoisie are for that purpose. All the social functions of the capitalist has no further social function than that of pocketing dividends, tearing off coupons, and gambling on the stock exchange, where the different capitalists despoil one another of their capital. At first, the capitalistic mode of production forces out the workers. Now it forces out the capitalists and reduces them, just as it reduced the workers to the ranks of the surplus population, although not immediately into those of the Industrial Reserve Army. But the transformation, either into joint stock companies and trusts or into state ownership, does not do away with the capitalistic nature of the productive forces. In the joint stock companies and trusts, this is obvious. And the modern state, again, is only the organization that bourgeois society takes on in order to support the external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against the encroachments as well of the workers as of individual capitalists. The modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalist, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist, the more citizens does it exploit. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relation is not done away with, it is rather brought to a head, but brought to a head, it topples over. State ownership of the productive forces is not the solution of the conflict, but concealed within it are the technical conditions that form the elements of that solution.
Awesome. I think it's a good spot to pause. I just want to point out a couple things that we saw in that section, which is one pretty good passage. It's the fact that we see that the first joint stock companies, then trusts, and then state ownership, they're taking over of the forces of production shows how unnecessary the bourgeoisie was, right? I think that was the, sorry, that, yeah, okay. That shows, that taking over shows how unnecessary they were in the first place. Clearly, if this can just be taken over by, first by, instead of many of the bourgeoisie, just a few, and then by the state itself, that we say, well, what were you doing this whole time anyway? If they could just be taken over and done better this other way, then what was it that you were doing that was so important? I think that's a nice section. Also, we see here that he's really pointing out that the state, the bourgeois state, that is, the capitalist state, is a representative of the bourgeoisie. That it's in a way kind of in the same way that the you know, that it's really not these ideas of socialism or ways that society or the world works is creates the way the world works. It's the other way around, and it's kind of like the way like the bourgeoisie exists. These class distinctions between them and their workers exist. So then the state sort of is a reflection of that, or is a necessary emergence from that arrangement. The state has to be there in order to sort of represent the bourgeoisie and mediate that relationship. And we see in this moment of crisis that they're forced to then even step in and take over. But he's very careful to say here that that this process, this eventual state ownership, it doesn't do away with the capitalist nature of the productive forces. So this might be a development towards socialism. It might be a continued socialization of the productive forces, but it doesn't do away with the capitalist nature. Now there's just simply one capitalist, it's the state, and there's still a separation between it and the workers. So I think that's a really good section that I love a lot. Anybody want to join in or read more?
Just one point, I'm sorry to talk to, but just on that, one good example of what he's talking about is even when the national health care, when capitalist country, during the debates, Biden attacked Sanders when Italy was having problems on health care. So, what doesn't Italy have national health care? And he's right, they do have national health care. And then right after that, I read an article that said how in Italy, the funding for the national healthcare system, because it's a bourgeois government, have been drastically slashed because they were imposing austerity, because the banks were imposing austerity on the country to pay the debt off, like we suffered in Detroit. So the first thing they went after was healthcare. And the same thing in Britain. There've been a lot of, Britain has national healthcare, but they've been dismantling the national health care system over the last number of years as they impose austerity all over Great Britain. There have been big demonstrations, and the same in Canada. So even national health care, well, we're for that demand. Can you really have a national health care system that benefits the people under capitalism? It's subject to the overall needs of the capitalist state. On the other hand, Cuba went through a period where they had literally, they were starved after the Soviet Union collapsed. And the one thing that didn't get cut was its healthcare system and education system, because human needs come first. So even when we talk about national health care in the confines of capitalism, we should always be careful and point out the limitations of national health care under capitalism. Because Medicare for All wasn't even national health care. And really, Medicare for All meant that the government would be paying the private health companies for our health care to make sure that they got their money off of the Medicare. But it's all, any demand that sounds socialist in the confines of capitalism is limited by the overall nature of this capitalist system, which is always based on profit and domination, especially in this period by finance capital and the banks.
Yeah, that's very important, because Sanders in the debates never raised that, and maybe it's because of tactical, considerations on his part. But yeah, there have been attacks on the national health services in Britain, and also in Canada. I've heard people on the left criticize some of the changes that have been made there as well. So this shows the difference that we have with Sanders on these questions, because the underlying, who controls the means of production within the society? What class does the state actually represent? So we cannot say that our model of socialism is in the imperialist countries like Canada and the Nordic countries and Scandinavian countries, because they all are part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, even though they do have national health insurance, which would be a big advance for people here in this country. And this is another contradiction, why Sanders, should be talking now, giving policy addresses on healthcare, giving alternative vision on how to deal with this crisis, how to reconstruct the national economy, because these are very important questions right now. The issue of guaranteed or universal health care, all these discussions on CNN, MSNBC, whatever, it's never raised. This really is such an irony that it was attacked during the debates. Now we have this pandemic that's sickened more people here in this country than anywhere else in the world, yet the whole central attack ram against the Sanders campaign was the Medicare for All. But now they don't even mention it. They don't even say anything about guaranteeing health care for people in this country. So it's really interesting how this whole situation is developed.
Get ready for the Wild Wild West.
I just have a quick comment. Those 16 to 20 million workers who have lost their jobs, many of them are going to lose their health care very soon. This is just another contradiction. It's hard to believe, but that's true.
Yeah, I got laid off a couple weeks ago. My company is still giving me health care for, I think they said it would be 90 days, which is pretty lucky. But after the 90 days, I don't know what that will bring. Yeah, I think Abiyumi brought up this the conversation about just healthcare, socialized healthcare in Europe versus in other countries. There's somebody that I argue with on Facebook, or try not to argue on Facebook, that was just bringing up that same thing also. Like, well, Europe, countries that have these nationalized healthcare systems haven't dealt with it well either. If anybody can explain, why Bernie Sanders' system is better, then can they explain that? And I never replied just because I didn't want to have to go into it. But if I could bring him into this conversation now, having got through everything we've gone through, I think this would be an adequate way to address it. That the European style of national or of socialized healthcare isn't you're looking in the wrong place. You got to look at some place like Cuba. Cuba, in spite of being under embargo for 60 years, being incredibly impoverished for that reason, they don't have new cars. They don't have so they're overall poor, but they've been able to prioritize their healthcare system such to the degree that they are now in like 50 countries helping out. I mean, it's mind-boggling. They have some of the most advanced medicines to treat this current situation. I mean, that's where you got to look,
I just wanted to say that it really seems like money taints things. And I don't know if you guys ever talk about just money in and of itself. I think that going off the gold standard was one thing, but just this control of basically fresh air money, it's not valuable in any way. There's nothing underneath it except for greed and deception and corruption and all that. I don't know what that would look like as far as trade, but we do have the internet now, and the ability exists for people to trade more than ever before, and for it to be easier to do smaller trades, which kind of cut the corrupt system and currency out of the equation. And there are organizations like right now, the only one I know of for sure is it's called Trade First. The government makes them pay money for taxes, but everything else is straight trade via trade dollars. I know that the only way to get out from underneath the currency is either if the currency bottoms out, at which point the whole thing just starts all over again, but at least gives you some kind of leverage from the bottom because you got nothing to lose, and or being able to convert it into trade. So I just wanted to offer that.
Does anybody want to talk about that at all? I mean, we could do a reading group about Capital Volume 1, Chapter 1, and talk about money and what money is, which is something that I think would be interesting, but it's pretty difficult. And I'm actually trying to read that right now. I think it becomes a question of how do you do that, or how do you getting really analytical about the kinds of things you're talking about, and staying away from anything that's sort of a reactionary method of getting rid of money, or just straight up returning to like a barter system or something that came earlier would be something that I'd like want to watch out against. But you know, I think it's a discussion that's worth having. I don't know. So the last thing that I thought was really important about the last section of reading was this last sentence: state ownership of the productive forces is not the solution of the conflict, but concealed within it are the technical conditions that form the elements of that solution. So there's always this dialectical process. The next stage always contains the seeds of the next step in the process. Does anybody want to volunteer to read the next section? Okay, Larry.
Okay, I'm on now. Yeah, this solution can only consist in the practical recognition of the social nature of the modern forces of production, and therefore in the harmonizing with the socialized character of the means of production. And this can only come about by society openly and directly taking possession of the productive forces which have outgrown all control except that of society as a whole. The social character of the means of production and of the products today reacts against the producers, periodically disrupts all production and exchange, acts only like a law of nature working blindly, forcibly, destructively. But with the taking over by society of the productive forces, the social character of the means of production and of the products will be utilized by the producers with a perfect understanding of its nature. And instead of being a source of disturbance and periodical collapse, will become the most powerful lever of production itself. Active social forces work exactly like natural forces, blindly, forcibly, destructively, so long as we do not understand and reckon with them. But when once we understand them, when once we grasp their action, their direction, their effects, it depends only upon ourselves to subject them more and more to our own will, and by means of them to reach our own ends. And this holds quite especially of the mighty productive forces of today. As long as we obstinately refuse to understand the nature and the character of these social means of action, and this understanding goes against the grain of the capitalist mode of production and its defenders, so long these forces are at work in spite of us, in opposition to us, so long they master us, as we have shown above in detail. But when once their nature is understood, they can, in the hand working together, be transformed from master demons into willing servants. The difference is as that between the destructive force of electricity in the lightning and the storm, and electricity under command in the telegraph and the voltaic arc. The difference between a conflagration and fire working in the service of man. With this recognition at last of the real nature of the productive forces of today, The social anarchy of production gives place to a social regulation of production upon a definite plan, according to the needs of the community and of each individual. Then the capitalist mode of appropriation, in which the product enslaves first the producer and then the appropriator, is replaced by the mode of appropriation of the products that is based upon the nature of the modern means of production. On the one hand, direct social appropriation as means to the maintenance and extension of production. On the other hand, direct individual appropriation as means of subsistence and of enjoyment. Whilst the capitalist mode of production more and more completely transforms the great majority of the population into proletarians, it also creates the power which, under penalty of its own destruction, is forced to accomplish this revolution. Whilst it forces on more and more of the transformation of the vast means of production already socialized into state property, it shows itself the way to accomplishing this revolution. The proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production into state property. But in doing this, it abolishes itself as proletariat, it abolishes all class distinction and class antagonisms, abolishes also the state as state. Society thus far, based upon class antagonisms, had need of the state, that is, an organization of the particular class which was pro tempore the exploiting class, an organization for the purpose of preventing any interference from without with the existing conditions of production, and therefore, especially for the purpose of forcibly keeping the exploited classes in the condition of oppression corresponding with the given mode of production, slavery or serfdom or wage labor. The state was the official representative of society as a whole, the gathering of it together into a visible embodiment. But it was this only insofar as it was the state of that class which itself represented for the time being society as a whole. In ancient times, the state of slave-owning citizens, in the Middle Ages, the feudal lords, in our own times, the bourgeoisie. When at last it becomes the real representative of the whole of society, it renders itself unnecessary. So long as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based upon our present anarchy and production, with the collisions and excesses arising from these, are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed. And a special repressive force, a state, is no longer necessary. The first act, by virtue of which the state really constitutes itself the representative of the whole of society, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, this is, at the same time, its last independent act as a state. State interference in social relations becomes, in one domain after another, superfluous, and then dies out of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the conduct of processes of production. The state is not abolished, it dies out. This gives the measure of the value of the phrase, the free state, both as to its justifiable use at times by agitators and as to its ultimate scientific insufficiency, and also of the demands of the so-called anarchists for the abolition of the state out of hand.
That might be a good pausing moment.
That might be a good pause. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for reading all that. That was really good.
All right.
Does anybody want to give any like observations that they saw? For anyone, I don't know if folks are familiar with Lenin's State and Revolution.
Right. Good.
But we could talk about that. I mean, that's something where he talks about there this concept of the basically the takeover of the state by the proletariat, as opposed to the abolition or smashing the state. And here Engels talks about anarchists who advocate for the abolition of the state. That's the anarchist view. Even though communists and anarchists seem to have a lot in common in terms of where they want to end up, the anarchist view tends to be smash the state, versus here what he's talking about and what Lenin talks about is the workers must seize and take over the state. And what Engels says here, I think pretty well somewhere, paraphrasing, he's, it's the socialist state's first action, which is to abolish class distinctions, is also its last action, because once class distinctions are abolished, the state is then rendered irrelevant, and as to use the Lenin term, it withers away. It doesn't have to be abolished after that point, because it just kind of ceases to function. That's something that gets talked about in State and Revolution, which is also a pretty popular and good text. That's also pretty short. And I think at one point, did we actually read that in this group? Although I don't think I was in the group at the time.
Yeah, we did some years back, and maybe we could revisit it again. But the State and Revolution, a lot of it is based on Engels' writings on and Marx on the Paris Commune, the Civil War in France, and when it was republished 20 years after the Paris Commune, and Engels wrote an introduction to the essay by Marx on the Paris Commune. So, yeah, that's why it's quite interesting. When you read State and Revolution, he draws heavily on Engels' writings.
What else? I liked his breakdown here of, and before that whole seize the state wither away thing, you got to get into what is the state. And he's talking about that the state represents society, but it represents a certain view of a certain class being representative of society. So it's ancient times, slave owning citizens, Middle Ages, feudal lords. Now in capitalism, the bourgeoisie. The state is a representative of the bourgeoisie. I like how it breaks it down there in that section.
I think there's a lot to be said in studying the question of the state now, because really, in many ways, it's the essence of what separates us as communists from the social democrats, because they believe that just through what do they say? You need a political revolution. They believe you create socialism without abolishing the state, where our view, of course, is that the state is not just the electoral apparatus, but it's the organization, the military, the police, it's the organization of the armed forces that come into play, and that has to be defeated. I mean, I just saw the film Battle of Chile while I was up, which people might want to watch. But if you ever want to see an example of that, that's a film, because it showed how Allende and the Popular Unity Party of Chile, they had a profound movement, and they won electoral power, but the bourgeoisie, and especially U.S. imperialism through the CIA, they didn't care. And Allende and them, the workers, for the last period of time, was clear that it was moving to an overthrow, and the workers kept pushing. We need arms. We need more nationalizations. And the Allende and them, and that's not saying Allende wasn't a revolutionary individual, but they were saying, no, we got to deal with the democratic apparatus. And then, boy, within about 3 weeks' time, they were overthrown by a coup that they just weren't able to defend their country against. And the revolution was dismantled, and Chile is still recovering from that act in the early 70s with the movement now. So, I mean, the other issue on the state, of course, is that history has shown that, until you have to put it into context. If we ever could get a revolution here, my instinct is, once we smash the remaining bourgeoisie, you could really move toward communism. But where there's been socialist countries, they've tried to have to build socialism in a world surrounded by capitalism and imperialism. So they've had to maintain a state apparatus to defend the gains of the workers, and in some ways a strong state apparatus to defend it. So we've never seen the conditions to moving toward what Engels is talking about here, and Lenin even discusses in State and Revolution, where the withering away of the state. And when you have the withering away of the state, then we'll start talking about things like Rebecca's talking about whole new forms of human relations. It's based, where money and all these things may become superfluous because everything's based on human need. But we got a ways to go before we're at that point, I think. But first thing we got to do is overthrow capitalism. Then we got to at least get a worker state. And then give us some time to smash the old bourgeoisie. Hopefully we can put them all to jobs on the assembly line.
Hear, hear. Jerry, you mentioned, was it at one point you're talking about worker states that were successful, but were not able to wither away because they are defending their gains. Do you think it would be fair to say, this is like just an honest, free associating sort of question, but do you think it'd be fair to say that by Engels' terms, when he says that the first and last act of the socialist state is to end class distinctions, would it be fair to say that those states had not or have not yet succeeded at that one goal, and therefore have not then been able to become superfluous?
Yeah, well, I mean, like even Marx and Lenin described the dictatorship of the proletariat, which was really a state based on the workers, but where we still had to have a state apparatus to deal with the remnants and the remains of the capitalist apparatus. And then, of course, when you look at the Soviet Union, they tried to build socialism. The first thing that they were confronted with, they were invaded by 17 countries. They were like an island. Well, when you got to have a pretty good state apparatus to, whatever the information, I don't want to get into that. But still, obviously, you can't just abolish the state, because you have to have a military apparatus to defend the gains of the revolution when it's besieged. Cuba too. Cuba's besieged. Cuba's 90 miles from the U.S. It's blockaded. Well, do we really believe that they can just have complete freedom in Cuba? They got to hold on to their state, because they're on a daily attack by imperialism, and they have to hold on to the state. So they're not in a condition where the state can just wither away and they can just have, the kind of communism that we all envision. They got to continually defend what they've gained. But once a revolution happens here, I think then we'll start really seeing the withering away of the state, because then once the U.S. gets out of the way, that's really the bastion of capitalism and imperialism. We get rid of that, then we can start really seeing the development, the moves toward communism, in my opinion.
All right. Does anybody want to take up the next section?
I can.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Since the historical appearance of the capitalist mode of production, the appropriation by society of all the means of production has often been dreamed of, more or less evil individuals as well as by sects, as the ideal of the future. But it could be historical necessity only when the actual conditions for its realization were there. Like every other social advance, it becomes practicable not by men understanding that the existence of classes is in contradiction to justice, equality, etc., not by the mere willingness to abolish these classes, but by virtue of certain new economic conditions. The separation of society into an exploiting and an exploited class, a ruling and an oppressed class, was the necessary consequences of the deficient and restricted development of production in former times. So long as the total social labor only yields a produce which by slightly exceeds that barely necessary for the existence of all, so long, therefore, as labor engages all or almost all the time of the great majority of the members of society, so long, of necessity, the society is divided into classes. Side by side with the great majority exclusively bond slaves to labor arises a class freed from directly productive labor, which looks after the general affairs of society, the direction of labor. state, business, law, science, art, etc. It is, therefore, the law of division of labor that lies at the basis of the division into classes. But this does not prevent this division into classes from being carried out by means of violence and robbery, trickery, and fraud. It does not prevent the ruling class, once having the upper hand, from consolidating its power at the expense of the working class, from turning its social leadership into an intensified exploitation of the masses. But if, upon this showing, division into classes has certain historical justification, it has this only for a given period, only under given social conditions. It was based upon the insufficiency of production. It will be swept away by the complete development of modern productive forces, and, in fact, the abolition of classes in society presupposes a degree of historical evolution at which the existence, not simply of this or that particular ruling class, but of any ruling class at all, and therefore the existence of class distinction itself, has become an obsolete anachronism. It presupposes, therefore, the development of production carried out to a degree at which appropriation of the means of production and of the products, and with this of political domination of the monopoly of culture and of intellectual leadership by a particular class of society, has become not only superfluous, but economically, politically, intellectually a hindrance to development. Would you like me to keep going?
Sure. Does anybody else? If you feel like it, definitely keep going.
I can do that, yeah. This point is now reached. Their political and intellectual bankruptcy is scarcely any longer a secret to the bourgeoisie themselves. Their economic bankruptcy recurs regularly every 10 years. In every crisis, society is suffocated beneath the weight of its own productive forces and products, which it cannot use, and stands helpless, face to face with the absurd contradiction that the producers have nothing to consume because consumers are wanting. The expansive force of the means of production burst the bonds that the capitalist mode of production had imposed upon them. Their deliverance from these bonds is the one precondition for an unbroken, constantly accelerated development of the productive forces, and therewith for a practically unlimited increase of production itself. Nor is this all. The socialized appropriation of the means of production does away, not only with the present artificial restrictions upon production, but also with the positive waste and devastation of productive forces and products that are at the present time of the inevitable committance of production, and that reach their height in the crises. Further, it sets free for the community at large a mass of means of production and of products by doing away with the senseless extravagance of the ruling classes of today and their political representatives. The possibility of securing for every member of society, by means of socialized production, an existence not only fully sufficient materially and becoming day by day more full, but an existence guaranteeing to all the free development and exercise of their physical and mental faculties. This possibility is now, for the first time, here, but it is here. With the seizing of the means of production by society, production of commodities is done away with, and simultaneously the mastery of the product over the producer. Anarchy in social production is replaced by systematic, definite organization. The struggle for individual existence disappears. Then, for the first time, man, in a certain sense, is finally marked off from the rest of the animal kingdom and emerges from mere animal conditions of existence into really human ones. The whole sphere of the conditions of life which environ man and which have hitherto ruled man now comes under the dominion of the control of man, who, for the first time, becomes the real conscious lord of nature, because he has now become master of their own social organization. The laws of his own social action hitherto, standing face to face with man's as law of nature foreign to, and dominating him, will then be used with full understanding and so mastered by him. Man's own social organization hitherto confronting him as a necessity imposed by nature and history, now becomes the result of their own free action. The extraneous objective forces that have to, hitherto, governed history pass under the control of man himself. Only from that time will man himself more and more consciously make his own history. Only from that time will the social causes set in movement by him have, in the main and in a constantly growing measure, the result intended by him. It is the ascent of man from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom.
Great. I think a couple things from that passage that I like are this idea that, you know, this recurrently kind of stalling out vehicle of capitalism that just keeps sputtering out every 10 years. He talks about its constraints and the continued free growth or the free development as being constrained by those bonds. And I like the idea that, you know, it's really those bonds that are all that's keeping us from being able to achieve the much better way of life that he's talking about here. And another thing that also is kind of like just a personal observation, that it seems like it's interesting to note that the kinds of things that Engels is talking about, and basically communism in general, isn't something where we talk about kind of getting away from capitalism by kind of going back, you know, backing away from it, and just kind of, it's not really a hippie ideology where we're kind of like, well, nature is, we're kind of like, we're kind of destroying nature and the way we live is unnatural. Like, let's kind of back off from this way and just kind of let nature be the guide. It's like he's actually really talking about basically humankind, or, you know, obviously mankind as he says here, but humankind gaining full, like, real control over nature. Obviously he doesn't mean by totally distinguishing nature, but just having complete control and just being able to be to direct those natural forces towards humankind's own benefit instead of this system that doesn't work. So I liked that passage just because, I mean, some people might not like it for the same reason, but I don't really see a lot of kind of sort of like kind of a nature-based, or like kind of like a hippie mentality fitting in with this at all. And I find that personally interesting. I wonder if other people have a certain reaction to it.
Yeah, there have been like utopian movements, even going way back to the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, where, you know, a lot of them were religious-based groups. Even during slavery in the United States, there was a group in Tennessee that this guy had set up like a separate community, you know, where blacks and whites could live. But it didn't stop the continuing encroachment of enslavement or the Civil War. So, you know, they usually don't last, these type of utopian communal type settings.
All right, well, we're like pretty close to the end. We're actually can finish. Does anybody want to finish it off? I'll do it.
Sure. Oh.
Or who's that?
Oh, I was just late to the punch, but you know,
No.
if you want to read it, you can
No,
read
go
it.
for
I can
it.
read it.
Go for it.
Alrighty. So anyways, after the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom, let us briefly sum up our sketch of historical evolution. 1. Medieval society. Individual production on a small scale means a production adapted for individual use, hence primitive, ungainly, petty, dwarfed in action. Production for immediate consumption, either of the producer himself or the feudal lord, only where an excess of production over this consumption occurs is such excess offered for sale, enters into exchange. Production of commodities, therefore, only in its infancy, but already it contains within itself in embryo, anarchy in the production of society at large. 2. Capitalist revolution. Transformation of industry, at first, be means of simple cooperation and manufacture, concentration of the means of production, hitherto scattered, into great workshops. As a consequence, their transformation from individual to social means of production, a transformation which does not, on the whole, affect the form of exchange. The old forms of appropriation remain in force. The capitalist appears in the capacity as owner of the means of production. They also appropriate the products and turn them into commodities. Production has become a social act. Exchange and appropriation continue to be individual acts, the acts of individuals. The social product is appropriated by the individual capitalist. Fundamental contradiction, whence arise all contradictions in which our present-day society moves and which modern industry brings to light. Alpha, severance of the producer from the means of production, condemnation of the worker to wage labor for life, antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Beta, growing predominance and increasing effectiveness of the laws governing the production of commodities, unbridled competition, contradiction between socialized organization in the individual factory and social anarchy in the production as a whole. Charlie, on the one hand, perfecting of machinery made by competition compulsory for each individual manufacturer and complemented by a constantly growing displacement of laborers, the industrial reserve army, for example. On the other hand, unlimited extension of production, also compulsory under competition for every manufacturer. On both sides, unheard of development of productive forces, excess of supply over demand, overproduction, and products. Excess there of laborers without employment and without means of existence. But these two levers of production and of social well-being are unable to work together because the capitalist form of production prevents the whole productive forces from working and the products from circulating unless they are first turned into capital, which their very superabundance prevents. The contradiction has grown into an absurdity. The mode of production rises in rebellion against the form of exchange. And finally, delta, partial recognition of the social character of the productive forces forced upon the capitalists themselves, taking over the great institutions for production and communication. First by joint stock companies, later in by trusts, then by the state. The bourgeoisie demonstrated to be a superfluous class. All its social functions are now performed by salaried employees. Let that sink in for a minute. Anyways, 3, proletarian revolution. The solution of the contradictions. The proletariat seizes the public power and by means of this transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property. By this act, the proletariat frees the means of production from the character of capital they have thus far borne, and gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon a predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. The development of production makes the existence of different classes of society thenceforth an anachronism. In proportion as anarchy in social production vanishes, the political authority of the state dies out. Humanity, at last, the master of their own form of social organization, becomes, at the same time, the lord over nature, their own master, free. To accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. To thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions and this, the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish. This is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement. Scientific socialism.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Wow, that's perfect timing, actually. It was 5 o'clock. Everybody should feel, we should all congratulate ourselves. That was some like heavy theory hours going on. Like we actually got through that whole thing. I'm pretty impressed. So good job. Scientific socialism. Anybody?
Thank you. Excellent job.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's 5 o'clock. It's kind of quitting time. I don't know that people might want to have something to add, but we've gone through all this thing the whole time. So
I wanted to add one thing, just real quick.
Uh-huh.
When they're talking about nature, I know we talked about Darwinism before, and then we talked about how we're actually made for cooperation at the last meeting. So I just wanted to make that distinction that when you're talking about nature, it's not necessarily survival of the fittest. That's not really, that's how they paint it, but that's not really how it has to be. And so scarcity versus abundance and looking at nature and the abundance of nature, I think is really key, and it kind of works into this whole, grab everything and hoard it because there's not going to be any, you know what I mean? Just like the whole thing of, and I think that if we were actually running things the way nature intended, that there would be abundance, and that just totally works into that. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
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 Thank you. Just on that, we had one year, I remember a Party Workers' World Conference we had, and Vernon Bellecourt was there from representing one of the great leaders of the native struggle. And at that conference, Sam Marks gave, I thought remarks that always stuck with me. He said, when we fight for communism, we're fighting for the communism and communalism that existed under the native people and under native people, but on the basis of abundance, And I thought that was a great comment, and that expressed, I thought, really what we're about. I mean, we want the communalism that existed in Africa and among the native tribes, but where it's not based on scarcity and fighting to survive, but where there's an abundance where people can live communally based on everybody's needs being able to be satisfied in a society free from want. And I think that's what our vision of communism is. And that always stuck with me.
Yeah, and I think that some people get that confused because the Darwinistic concept of survival of the fittest is pushed so heavily as the base nature, when really even in the animal kingdom you see different species helping each other in certain ways in certain situations, and that loving instinct to share and to give and of abundance is reflected in nature more so than even the survival. So I think that's one of the key things that really needs to mainstream in our society.
It's reflected in most of human history. I mean, Marxism was developed coincidentally with the development of anthropology, where they were able to show how for most of human history, people lived communally. And there wasn't women's oppression, and LGBT people weren't oppressed. People lived in a communal way. It was only the advent of private property that led to this kind of dog-eat-dog world that we have now. And as I said, that our vision is to revive human history, but based on a period where technology can allow that communalism to be based on being able to meet human needs easily and everyone live comfortably and cooperatively.
And be able to be creative and do something besides just survive all the time.
Work 40 hours a week. Yeah,
yes.
With technology, we should all be working 20 hours a week.
Yeah, and be able to utilize skills and abilities that being pushed into survival mode doesn't allow. Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yep. just to briefly share a comment, it's only been like only 2 years ago since I got out of high school, and I still remember like how in every history class or even just a language arts class, which is English class, like they would always push these books down our throats that basically said that not only are we trying to survive, we're basically just evil, snobbish devils just killing people, and that's our primal whatever nature. And it's just like been the most horrifying thing to hear because it's so utterly ridiculous, and yet they buy into it. So we have a lot of deprogramming of the capitalist you know psychology to do, basically.
Right. While we're confined, maybe someone should take it on, changing all the old works from man to human and human.
Yeah, thank you for doing that.
That'd be a good
in
project.
your reading.
Oh, trust me, as a trans person.
Yeah. Maybe there's a way to do it now.
Yeah, find and replace. It's easy.
Yep. Soon it'll just be in brackets, and we'll have footnotes like, this used to be man, because translators.
Yeah, I mean, they do that all the time. The footnote, and they're like, the original text changed at such and such date. That's constant in Marxist theory.
Yeah, a good project.
While we were talking about anthropology, I also want to give a plug and a shout out to the other Engels text, which I can't. What's the
Origin of Family?
Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. I think would go a long way towards addressing some of the things that we were just talking about. And then also, by the way, and shout out to Jackson for giving me this. It was the Roots of Gay and Lesbian Oppression. A book that was, I think, published by Workers' World, which is kind of a nice add-on to Engels' book and puts gay and lesbian LGBT stuff into context as well, because that's kind of missing in Engels' work.
Yeah,
but it's still a
kind
really
of
good
necessary to read with on the origins of the family. You got to kind of pair them together because Engels isn't exactly dated in the origins of the family, but there's just a lot of missing pieces that the Roots of Lesbian and Gay Oppression, a Marxist view, kind of fill that I deeply enjoy.
It was written in the early 70s. It was really the first Marxist work to put a materialist analysis, a Marxist analysis, to the origin, to an analysis. One of the early ones, anyway, was done by Bob McCubbin. And then, of course, the writings of Leslie Feinberg on the trans struggle took that analysis and applied it to an understanding of trans liberation as well. And it's just tremendous works. I mean, Leslie she did actually a series. I mean, just a history of the LGBTQ trans movement. It was article after article, but her works are incomparable in terms of putting a revolutionary analysis to the development of the trans liberation movement.
Awesome.
Agreed.
Well, I think we should probably wrap it up. Maybe I think there's ways to reach out to the attendees, if I'm not mistaken, based on the registration process. But we could send out some of these texts that we've just mentioned, and also talk about doing more classes. I think we're kind of at CWL, the Communist Workers League, is sort of chiseling out this time every week to do a reading group or some sort of class, so we can spread information about that. And also, again, on Monday, we're having our Moratorium Now meeting about Cuba and this current crisis and everything we talked about with regard to medical help and reaching out to them. And it also ties in again to this divide between a socialized productive forces versus the capitalist mode that isn't equipped to deal with the crisis, and how it really shines a light on that. So if you're interested in all this stuff, I think the Cuban meeting is a really obvious thing to get involved in on Monday at 7. So yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything else to say, Mike, or anybody else, CWL people?
It was a great class.
Great class, and good we're doing these classes, continuing, with our historical materialists and dialectical materialists readings. So yeah, this is wonderful.
I do have everyone's email, and we can send out links. Give us some time, maybe by tomorrow morning or something. I just want to say one other thing about why this supporting Cuba right now is real important. And I think it goes to your concerns about the dominance of money in our society, Rebecca. In Cuba, they don't have national health insurance. They don't need it. You have access to health care because you're a human being on that island. And what that means is they've essentially, on a personal basis, taken money out of the equation. This is a very poor country, but you don't need money to get health care. Now, if you work in a workers' co-op or some of these new economic formations that they're allowed to happen, your co-op may have to make a contribution to the state budget. But you don't. But it's not like here. They've really taken the money out of the equation. So they still need the state though, and they still have to deal with money because they need resources to exchange with other countries in the world. But already you can see a little bit that you can, on things like food, you could take money out. They've essentially taken money out of the food as well. When I was there were two prices that you paid. One for everybody coming out of the country they knew had money, and there was a much cheaper price for people living in Cuba. And that was if they wanted to get food above what their allotments were. So once we take control of the state, we can immediately begin to do that. And so I recommend people supporting the Cuba work that we're doing, because this is going to open a lot of people's eyes as we move forward in these crises. So I'll let Jason send the email out, but I'll give you the access to all the emails, Jason.
I appreciate the clarification. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah.
All right. Well, everybody, once again, congratulations for having like a serious theory session. Good job. Keep it going. I recommend doing it.
Thank you.
And yeah.
Great job, Jason.
All right. Thank you.
Great job.
All right. Bye, y'all.
All right, see you guys.
Do widzenia.